い全国大会目指して頑張ってみたいかあの若い頃の気持ちを取り戻せたら良いのにもしよろしければ行きましょうか願いが叶う街にその時間楽しい年に行くもしかして知ってるのやのととすがり出会う嫌なものって答えそうかもしれない知りて素晴らしいものそれは救いの神道だ我々の忘れおいでこれは愛の告白願って忘れましょう成長の苦悩世界を恋になり雨のアウハウと叫んで気合い入れよう恋の願うの今日の今日のベケーション今日
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman.
And Jonathan Lack.
We are here to kick back, relax, and talk about some anime this week on the show. We are continuing part 7 of our Kyoto Vacation, where we're talking all things Violet Evergarden. Last week we went through the TV show, and today we're going to talk about the first Violet Evergarden movie, Violet Evergarden Gaiden, Eternity and the Auto Memory Doll, or as I learned when I watched the Blu-ray, they did put a number 1 on the title on the Blu-ray for the English language version. They called it Violet Evergarden 1, Eternity and the Auto Memory Doll. Not seen it called that anywhere else. I'm curious to watch the Blu-ray for Violet Evergarden, the movie. They put a 2 on that. But yes, this is the first Violet Evergarden film, what is effectively kind of 2 mega episodes of the show put together to tell the story of 2 sisters who both meet Violet. I think it is a great movie. It's a very interesting movie because it's very different structurally than I think what you usually think of, because it is very much trying to be in the same style as the kind of standalone episodes of the show. And this is a movie I liked a lot on first watch. On rewatching it, I love it even more. I think it's a great film.
I adore this movie. I like it more than the show. I think it's my favorite Violet Evergarden thing so far. I mean, more than the show. You know what I mean? It's like, it's hard to say, like, I don't think, like, the show is now bad or anything. What I just mean is that if you were to treat this as an episode, it would be my favorite episode. I just think it's phenomenal. And I think part of it is, this is the feature directorial debut of one Fujita Haruka. And phenomenal. Another just, I think, stupendous, huge, and probably ongoing talent that Kyoto Animation has, you know, brought up and introduced through to the world. And I think this movie is stupendously directed. I think you get, you know, her style is very different than Yamada Naoko's, but I think you get definite shadings of looking at, like, Kyo in the movie or Tomoko Love Story, of, like, this person's wings have been let go to fly, and they are a genius. It is incredible. And I think, you know, one thing we're going to talk about is this is the first Kyoto Animation production done in anamorphic widescreen, 239:1, and it looks stunning. There are a lot of anime that have been doing this lately because it is something that has become easier to do now that we have digital compositing and digital finishing. But I've very rarely seen it done this well, and I think it is a absolute masterclass in cinematography and compositing and composing of the image, as well as being just a tremendous story that I think is the version of Violet Evergarden that is my favorite version, which is these kind of like standalone stories where Violet is not necessarily your main, she's the protagonist, but not really the main character of the story. Mm-hmm. And I think she works so well in that mode. And, you know, I just, whenever the word Gaiden comes up, I'm excited at this point, because I feel like all the best things are Gaidens. You know, you got this, Fire Emblem Gaiden is my favorite Fire Emblem, specifically the remake Echoes. You know, Like a Dragon Gaiden is a really good Like a Dragon game. Just all the Gaidens, you're always in for something special.
Yeah, and I think it's something where I do wish that the English language title had called it like Violet Evergarden Side Story or something. Because I think when I first watched the movie years ago, I did really like it, but it took me a little bit to get into it because I think it was different than what I expected. Particularly the second half of the movie was different than what I expected, because Violet is very much in the background of this movie. It is much more like episode 10 or kind of like episode 6 of the show, where she is
my
really
two favorite
in the background.
episodes.
Yes,
Yeah.
but those are the episodes that are most from the guest star's POV.
Yes.
And if you're like going into this movie with a vague expectation of like, this is the next chapter in the saga of Violet Evergarden, like that's not what it is. And I didn't know anything when I first watched the film. If you call it Violet Evergarden side story, it gives you the right expectation. If you have the right expectation coming to the movie, yeah, it is really amazing. And I think it's one thing that really stood out to me on this watch through, because I got to watch it on Blu-ray rather than just streaming it on Netflix, is just how gorgeous the movie is, including the cinematography with the widescreen format. But it's just such a luscious looking movie with so much detail, both in the backgrounds and in the characters. There are multiple shots in this film that are these close-ups that are like impossibly gorgeous, and the detail on like hair and the way that color and light operates in this film. It is a highlight of the aesthetic of the TV show. But you watch that TV show and you're like, oh man, this looks as good as a movie. But then you get like, well, what is the movie version of the TV show that looks like as good as a movie? It is something like on a whole other level. And especially being able to watch it in a better format really highlighted that for me, just how good this movie looks.
We said something similar when we watched KyoAni the movie way back in another lifetime, of like, because that show looked so incredible. It's like, how does it look any better? And then, oh my God, it can look even better. And KyoAni just keeps surprising us. And this is one of the biggest leaps because, moving to a different shooting format, a different kind of widescreen, that's not just we're putting more spit and polish into the animation. That is, if you are doing it right, and they are doing it right here, we are composing the image completely differently than we did before. And that is why this feels so like of a different like scale than the TV show does, because it's not even composed on the same kind of like visual logic, because it can't be if you're going to make actual use of that space. And this movie reminds me of how many films, particularly live action, but sometimes animation, when they do this, just do not make use of that space, and it's awesome.
Yeah, it's just phenomenal. Any other stuff we want to talk about up top, or do we want to just go ahead and get into the meat of the thing, or get into the history?
No, Sean, I think we should probably just dive right in, because I think we've got a lot to get into today, and I'm excited to break it all down.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into the history section here. So after the completion of the TV show, the staff began discussions about possibilities of continuing the series in different ways. And so that's when scriptwriter Yoshida Reiko proposed the idea of adapting stories from what was at the time the new Violet Evergarden novel called Violet Evergarden Gaiden, which had been published in March 2018. And the original idea was, let's make 2 different OVA episodes. And then at the same time, they started making discussions about, well, do we want to do a continuation, something that's a more direct follow-up of Violet's story? And that sort of conversation eventually becomes Violet Evergarden, the movie, which we'll talk about next week. As development on the OVA episodes began, the project eventually expanded to becoming a full movie. They kind of quickly realized, okay, this project is getting bigger than just it's a couple of extra OVAs. And at that point, Fujita Haruka was at the helm of making her first directorial debut as a film director. And as well as just like the first time she was in charge as director of a whole project, because she never directed a full TV show. She was that series Enshutsu kind of assistant director role on the show. This led to Gaiden and then the more ambitious Violet Evergarden, the movie, to begin production simultaneously. So while Fujita was making Gaiden, Ishidate Taichi and that team, well, that team, they obviously share a lot of people. He started sort of spearheading the Violet Evergarden, the movie project, which is a 2.5-hour movie, a wholly original story, and like a much bigger thing. The first half of Gaiden adapts one of the stories from the novel. So all the stuff at like the castle with Amy, that's all from the book. Obviously they're making adaptational choices, but that's where that comes from. But the second half of the movie, where they kind of make a sequel story to Amy's story featuring her sister Taylor, that is all an anime original. So the second half of the movie is that kind of how, it turns from just being like OVA stuff to being now this is a film with a larger overall story.
So is the book...
Yeah.
Like one of those short story collections you sometimes get with light novels, so it's got multiple stories? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and that's how all the Violet Evergarden novels are. They're all effectively short story collections, just with usually a spine of a main plot, kind of like what the TV show is. But yes, Gaiden's novel specifically is just additional short stories in the world of Violet Evergarden, set during the timeline of the first 2 books. Early on in the production of the film, Fujita made the choice to widen the aspect ratio from the show's 16:9 to 2.31:1. But you, Jonathan, have added a note here.
I don't know where that comes from. Where did you get, like, I've seen that in multiple places. That's not an aspect ratio. It's 239 to 1.
On the Kyoto Animation website for Violet Evergarden the movie, which is they is pulling a screenshot from the show, they do just say, hey, this is 16.9 or 16 to 9, and this is 2.31 to 1.
I have no idea what that is. It's the Blu-ray is 239. I can just tell you it is 239. The Netflix version streaming is 239. That is a visible difference. Maybe it was animated at that, and it was exhibited, because no one would exhibit it. That's not an aspect ratio you can exhibit at 231. It's 239 is the exhibition ratio. So it's possible it was animated with a little more on the top and bottom that we don't see. It probably was actually animated with quite a bit more on the top and bottom, because that's how this is done. But yeah, the finished version that you are watching on Netflix or on the Blu-ray is 239.
Interesting. One thing I did find in one of the interviews, because Fujita is the person who made this choice, and this choice does follow through to the Violet Evergarden, the movie, as well. So Ishidate Taichi chooses to keep the same aspect ratio. And the one, like, interesting thing that Fujita was like, and early on in production, we're like, well, we can just sort of use the same paper we were using for our storyboards and just sort of, like, widen out a little bit. And then very quickly, that just kind of became impractical. So we just made different paper. But I thought it was like a funny anecdote of, a studio that basically has always just done 16 to 9 for, its modern life as a studio, having to figure out, okay, how do we do this, like, much wider aspect ratio?
It is interesting because, like, and different studios do it differently. I have the Genga books for the last Neon Genesis Evangelion movie, the rebuild of Evangelion movie, 3.0 plus 1.0, and that is a 239 to 1 movie. And it's interesting, they basically did do all the animation and layouts within a 16:9 frame, because that's just what the paper looks like, but with basically guide marks on where they were going to cut it off. Because also when you're drawing, sometimes it is easier to just draw beyond where the frame would go so that you can complete the shape, even if the viewer isn't going to see it. So I'm curious, and again, I think this is we can talk about this later, but, like, there is a big history in animation in Japan of, in the 60s, Toei did a bunch of movies in 235 to 1 or 239 to 1, but then that went out of style because shooting that way with actual film is really hard. You have to use an anamorphic lens. It's so, like, the actual photography process is a difficulty in addition to everything else. Now you're doing that, you're finishing and scanning it into a computer. So it's more these kind of questions that you're outlining, Sean, of, like, how do we do the storyboards and the layouts and that kind of stuff? So it's less of a technical challenge than a sort of conceptual challenge. And you are seeing it more and more now in the last 10 years of anime because it is possible again. But it is kind of funny. People do it different ways because there is no standardization for it.
Yeah, because, everything is set up for the current normal standard of 16:9 for TV productions, which is where, like, 99% of their work is going to go into. So, yeah, it is interesting to see, like, how do we do it differently? And it is just, like, it's such a perfect choice for Violet Evergarden as a series in particular. Like, you just have the big, like, open landscapes, and then for this movie, you've got all the interiors of this giant castle. That, like, that extra space in the wider frame, I think, just really fits the content of this series specifically really well in a way that you could, obviously you could make this choice for other KyoAni productions, but if it was we're a bunch of school kids in our club room and stuff like that, I don't know if you need the crazy ultra wide aspect ratio, but there's a lot
I think it would be an active disservice in a lot of, like, KyoAni subject matter to go that wide. It would be ridiculous. But, like, you're absolutely right. This is the one that feels like, yes, this is where you should do it.
Yeah. So it's very, very cool and very canny choice by Fujita to do this, and awesome that Ishidate continues it in the Violet Evergarden, the movie we'll talk about next week, also looks fucking awesome. So one other cool thing about the movie is that they were not able to do location scouting for the TV show, because obviously the show takes place in a fictionalized version of Europe, so even doing location scouting is kind of a what do you even do? And then also being a Japanese studio, it's not an easy or trivial thing to do. But for this film, they did do location scouting in Germany, and they did specifically go to actual castles and use those as reference for the girls' school and things like that. And Fujita talked about in one of the interviews I read of her looking at, like, oh, here's how they, like, the doorways, like the big arched doorways are. And he's like this giant castle door that then has a little door that you actually use that's carved into the side of it, right? And kind of looking at all those details and trying to sort of, make it a little bit more of a lived-in, realistic location, especially for something like that castle that is the whole first half of the movie is just set in that one place. This is where the history becomes pretty sad. So The movie finished its editing process on July 17th, 2019. So the movie was, for, all intents and purposes, effectively finished at that point. 1 day before the arson attack. So the arson attack on Kyoto Animation Studio, their first studio, happened on July 18th, 2019. And that is where 36 people were killed and then 34 more were injured. So we've been kind of coming up to this point historically in a lot of what we've been talking about, and this production is what fully intersects with when the arson attack happened. And we talked about like a lot of the details around the arson attack specifically in the first episode of our Kyoto Vacation, which is literally a year ago. So if people have forgotten some of those details, you can go back to that section just to go over some other stuff related to the attack here, because it's kind of impossible when I was doing research and looking at people related to the film not to notice just how many people involved in the production of the movie lost their lives. So in response to the tragedy, Fujita requested that every person involved in the production of the movie be credited at the end, because the studio's policy was that only staff that had been at the studio for at least a year were credited at the end process. But she said, hey, let's have everybody there on the credits at the end, anybody involved with the film. And there were only 4 people of the 36 who died in the attack that were not involved in the production. So 32 people involved in the production of the film, either directly or tangentially, lost their lives in the attack. The 4 people who were not listed in the credits for this film were Yumi Kaneo, Nishikawa Maiko, Murayame Chitose, and Matsumoto Kojiro. And then we have 32 people who lost their lives in the attack. And I went ahead and I've listed them out here associated with their credit on the film, because there were multiple people that I was looking up that I noticed like, oh, right, okay, this person lost their life, this person lost their life, and figured let's just kind of go through it. For some of these first ones, I have a couple of notes, because these are the first people I was looking up, because I was curious about some of the color stuff in the movie, and that's kind of where I ended up going down this rabbit hole of kind of looking up everybody. One thing I'll also say, if you're interested and want to learn more about the people who lost their lives and just kind of get a sense of it from that perspective, Anime News Network has a really great 2-part article called The Incredible Artists of Kyoto Animation that goes through everybody and goes through and kind of talks about everybody in detail of like kind of where they came from, what their age was, what work they had done. I don't have that for everyone here. I have like a couple of notes for some people. If you want to learn more, you can go there. But it's, this incredible, awful tragedy. And it's just, it's something we need to talk about a bit. So here are some of the people, and I've listed them through their credits on the film. So the art director of the movie was killed in the attack, Watanabe Mikiko. So she's the art director of the film and the TV series. She had also been the art director on Beyond the Boundary, Myriad Colors Fandom World, Amagi Brilliant Park, and Kobayashi-san's Maid Dragon. And she had been a background artist on basically everything since K-On! So she'd been at the studio since about 2009. And was an art director on so much stuff. Obviously, kind of brought into that role on Ishidate's Beyond the Boundary, and then here on Violet Evergarden as well. And, that's that role as art director, I think, is so potent on the series and the film. So that's one of the first ones I noticed when I was looking up credits, that I had not paid attention to that credit very closely previously, but she had been that on a bunch of stuff. Animation directors, so 3 of the people who are animation director, not chief animation director, but obviously you've got like a whole bunch of people that do this role. 3 of them lost their lives, one of them being Ikeda Shoko, who we talked about a lot. She's obviously character design and chief animation director on the Haruhi series and on Sound Euphonium. And so she was killed in the attack. Maruko Tatsunari, one of the animation directors, was killed in the attack. And Myoken Yuko was also killed in the attack. So 3 of our animation directors, those other 2 who had been there since Hyoka. 2 of the production managers of the film were killed, Fujita Takahisa and Yokota Keisuke. The color coordinator for the movie, Ishida Naomi, was killed. She had been a colorist at KyoAni since 1993, and she is credited on every single thing we have covered this season at one level or another. And this is the person who I looked up specifically because it's like, man, the color in the movie is so gorgeous. I wonder who this is. And I recognized Ishida Naomi. I've seen that name a lot. Then clicked it and then saw that she had passed away. I was like, fuck it. This is awful. Color
coordination, that is one of those jobs at a studio that the person will be around forever, because when you find the right one, you stick with them. That's true at like Studio Ghibli too. And yeah, that's 30 years at KyoAni. It's amazing.
Yeah. 2 people in the Finnish animation department were killed in the attack, Otonorie and Tsuda Sachie. Sachie specifically had been there since the 90s. We have a lot of people in the animation department. So in between animation, we've got a bunch of people lost their lives. Ishida Atsushi, Miyaji Atsushi, Sato Aya, Uda Junichi, Matsuda Kana, Togimori Tomoka, Kasama Yuka, and Omura Yuki all lost their lives. And then for key animation, it's Kurigi Ami, Takahashi Hiroyuki, whom we've talked a lot about recently because he was the music instrument director on Sound Euphonium, and he was also the person who did the the animation for Violet's arms on Violet Evergarden. Other key animators, Sato Kota, Takechi Miho, Iosaki Nami, Suzuki Sana, Watanabe Sayaka, Kawaguchi Seiya, Morisaki Shiho, and Kusano Sumire. So obviously it's the animators were the people who were, because it was attack on the animation studio when they were in the process of making different things. And so the majority of people who were killed were people who were doing animation. So that's the bulk of the names. And all this is like one of the things that's really sad when you look through it is you just notice it is it's a spread of people, some of whom had just started working there, who were, like 20, 21, 22 years old. Some of the youngest people, and then people who were in their 40s who had been working there since the early 90s. And it kind of, you see the whole scope of people and everywhere, obviously in between, losing their lives in this horrible attack. And it's very sobering when you look at the scope of all the people who were killed here. Then we have three more names who are credited on the film, even though they were not directly involved in the production, but they're three people so big that they're credited on basically everything because their influence touches everything in the studio. The first being Nishiya Futoshi, the animator, character designer, chief animation director, obviously on stuff going all the way back. We talked about him with Haruhi Season 2, which is where he started that role of chief animation director. And then on various things throughout, including Kyoka, and then obviously very notably Liz and the Bluebird and a silent voice in his sort of two partnerships with Yamada Naoko near the end of his life, which, his work, incredible, just like...
You said before that his work, like when you get to Haruhi Season 2, feels like is when KyoAni's style locks into place.
Yes.
And I think looking back on it now, in the same position you were, I would agree. I mean, that is kind of a turning point aesthetically.
Yeah, and he was, very much one of the people primarily responsible for that. Then also in supporting staff is Takemoto Yasuhiro, whom we, of course, talked about a lot, the director of Kyoka, the director of, their first ever original anime, Full Metal Panic Fumafu, which we didn't cover because it's attached to the Full Metal Panic stuff. Also the second raid. We'll also talk about Ms. Kobayashi's Maid Dragon after we get through all the Violet Evergarden stuff, which he was the director of that show, and just one of the great animators, great directors, and people at KyoAni. And then, of course, the third and final name on supporting staff was Kigami Yoshiji, the man himself, the genius, the guy who sort of took KyoAni as this sort of relatively small house that mostly did in-between work and finish animation and stuff like that throughout the 80s, and then slowly started building up a larger library of work. Once you get into the 90s, with him and under his direction in the animation stuff, turned it into what Kyoto Animation is, and the guy who mentored people like Takemoto Yasuhiro, Ishihara Tatsuya, Ishidate Taichi, to then be the people who took on most of the primary director work when it became a studio that did its own stuff. And a man who was one of the main teachers and instructors at the in-house KyoAni technical school, and just had such a huge role in that studio, and just one of the all-time great animators, who was an all-time great animator and had an all-time great career before he was even at KyoAni in his work on films like Akira. And of course, he lost his life in the attack as well. And so that is the people who were killed in this just like incomprehensible, awful tragedy.
And I know we have a couple more bits of history before we get to the movie, but it strikes me this movie, I think, cues in on a theme that is there in the show that is about the impact people have even when they're gone. And about the way people can mentor and continue their impact on you even when they are gone. There's a very striking moment where, Anne, I guess what's her name in the Isabella in her like formal role, says
Amy
that Amy,
birth name.
Yeah, says that, you're very kind, Violet, and Violet says, I learned this from someone while she's clutching her brooch. And in the second half of the movie, it is so much about, the things that Amy has done for Taylor, even though Taylor can't even really remember her anymore. And, those are names who will, live on for the future history of Japanese animation, no matter what, because like the number of people they either literally instructed and who will go on to instruct more people, or who watched Kyoto Animation stuff and were inspired to make their own things. is countless. Violet Evergarden itself is a thing that was submitted to Kyoto Animation for the novel contest because the author liked Clannad. I mean, these things, those things echo out throughout time in such a big way, and it just is not lost on me that is also what this film is very literally about.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those sort of strange twists of fate that this happened while they were working on Violet Evergarden, which is such a series about exploring these kinds of emotions, and working through these kinds of ideas. Yeah, and it's so awful. And it's the thing we talked about last week when we talked about the TV show. It's the kind of thing you just can't wrap your head around, and it's when you actually go through and look at all the names and look at, you know, how it touched all these people in all these ways. And then, of course, there's all the impact afterwards that has on the people who were injured and the people who survived, but, you know, the grief of losing all these coworkers and friends and family. I mean, it's just like incomprehensible to think about the impact that this had. And yeah, it's just truly tragic. So it happened, again, the movie was effectively finished when this happened. So then there was obviously lots of concern immediately about, there's primary concern about the welfare of the people at the studio, but also questions, I guess, about what is this going to do for this film that had been announced and advertised was going to release. They did officially say on July 28th that the movie was not going to move its date or anything. It was going to retain its original planned date on September 6th, 2019. But they did expand its originally planned limited theatrical run, which was originally just going to be a 2-week run, which is not unusual for a movie like this, right, that's at a smaller scale, and moved that to a 3-week run. Very quickly, it ended up being a lot more than a 3-week run realistically, which is also what often happens with these films. The movie actually premiered, this is something that I'd never heard of before. It premiered in Germany at the Animagic 2019 convention in Germany on August 3rd, which is like a weird, cool thing. There's a bunch of like Reddit posts on the Violet Evergarden subreddit of a bunch of people being like, oh my God, like, you know, I feel like people living in Germany probably don't get seen much in the anime fan community, and getting to see this movie at a convention in your country, like, that's very awesome. So that's
the international premieres at animation specific film festivals is more and more common. We finally have one in America now called Annecy that is put on by the same people who run G Kids, the distributor, who they release the Studio Ghibli movies. And Naoko Yamada's latest movie, The Colors Within, premiered at the latest Annecy for its global premiere last month. So I just think it's a cool trend that we're seeing more and more, because for some shitty reason, mainstream film festivals like Cannes don't put in animation much. And so I'm glad that there's an alternative, you know, film festival circuit for animation, because movies like this should be on the film festival circuit. And that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I'm a little bit bummed out that Yamada Naoko's new movie didn't premiere in Scotland like Silent Voice and KO in the movie did, because that, to me, that's where Yamada Naoko movies go first, is for the Scottish. You know, maybe for a next film that we'll get to go back there. So that's where it premiered. The movie was a massive success. It immediately got its initially planned 3-week run, or its originally planned 2-week that became 3-week. It then became sort of like indefinitely extended in select theaters for a long time. It received the #1 rating for its weekend on the PIA Audience Satisfaction Survey, so people who saw the movie loved it. And then it grossed a massive 831 million yen, almost matching the gross of Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi, which was 840 million yen. So this kind of immediately became the, 4th highest grossing movie behind Silent Voice, KO the movie, Disappearance, and then this for KyoAni's theater productions. And then below that, the next one would be Sound Euphonium Chicano Finale, but that was like 320, I think, million yen. So it's a pretty huge gap. So the movie was a big hit, made a lot of money, and then also was very successful on home video. The home release sold 24,802 copies in its first week, and it doubled that to nearly 50,000 copies by March 2020, which was the last time those numbers were reported in the lead up to Violet Evergarden, the movie, coming out. But also, as with the TV series, this movie was made in collaboration with Netflix, so it did become available after its theatrical run on Netflix in Japan and internationally, which makes the numbers even more impressive to me that it also pretty quickly ended up on streaming, but people still were going to shell out a lot of money for that limited run Blu-ray because of how fucking good this movie is.
Nice that it's on streaming. As with all Netflix things, this deserves to be in theaters also in places like the US, and it's unconscionable that they don't do that. And I am glad that Yamada Naoko's new movie is not released by Netflix, so we can go see it in theaters this fall. Because fuck you, Netflix. But thank you for funding Violet Evergarden, I guess. But let it play in theaters too, please.
Yeah, but it's pretty wild to me that this movie made that guy, because I knew that, and we'll talk about with Violet Evergarden the movie, that movie was a big hit. I did not realize that Gaiden was, because especially since it's marketed as Violet Evergarden Gaiden, people knew that Violet Evergarden the movie was in production at the same time. That had already been announced. And so it's interesting that, even though this was not the, next chapter in the story, quote unquote, in terms of, it does push the timeline forward, but it's not about Violet's development or anything like that. It's marketed as a side story. It still made a shit ton of money. So it's very cool.
Yeah. And I think obviously the fire and the press around that would have played a role, in people wanting to go see and support the new KyoAni thing. But also, Violet Evergarden is so good, and this movie is so good, I feel like it's just the kind of thing where any increased word of mouth would snowball for something like this, because once you're in the theater, it's a good movie. It is also a movie that you could very easily go see without seeing the TV show. I don't think it's like Liz and the Bluebird, where it feels made kind of with that intent. There's obviously a lot of richness that is there from the show, but there's no reason this couldn't be your introduction to Violet Evergarden, especially because Violet is such an archetypal, strong character in that way, and in this movie reads in that kind of Mary Poppins way where, you just get it as soon as you see her, kind of what her deal is. Yeah,
absolutely. So then in terms of the crew, we kind of went over it in some ways already, but it is the director and storyboards are both Fujita Haruka. She storyboarded the film. Ishidate Taichi has a credit that's just supervising director or supervision. So he was obviously involved, and Fujita Haruka talks about in some interviews I read about, a little bit back and forth with him on different elements of the movie, but obviously his main focus was on making his own movie.
Tachi Ishihara had a credit like this on Liz and the Bluebird as well, so it's the same kind of thing. Yeah.
And Ishidate Taichi was making a 2.5-hour fucking beast of a movie. I've heard the movie is a big animated film, so he's pretty busy. And obviously Fujita is more than capable of handling this movie on her own. Yoshida Reiko also technically is credited here as series composition, which I find interesting. I mean, this is just her credit she has on the TV show. I have no idea what that means practically. We know that she was involved in the conceptualization phase of the movie. But I just find it interesting that it just gave her the same credit she has on the show. But the screenplay for the movie was by the two other writers from the show, Suzuki Takaaki and Urahara Tatsuhiko, who they did episodes 5 and 12 for Suzuki, and Urahara did 3, 6, 11, the OVA for the show. So, they kind of were handling the screenplay for this one, because Yoshida is making the screenplay for Violet Evergarden, the movie, while this movie is in production.
It makes sense. I mean, Yoshida Reiko is still if you were to do this as an American TV show, it would be created by Yoshida Reiko would be the credit as the head writer. So for the movie version, you would, keep that intact.
Yeah. I just find you just look at that credit and on the face of it, you're like, what does that even mean? What does series Kosei mean for this movie is very confusing. If you don't know that she was that on the TV show. Character design and chief animation director is once again Takase Akihiko, of course, who did this role on the TV show. The composer, once again, is Evan Call. This movie does have some new music, but it uses a lot of the music from the TV show, which is obviously not a problem. He does a whole huge, elaborate album for Violet Evergarden, the movie. But obviously they're all using his music for this film.
The movie album also has a second disc with, I think it's 7 or 8 tracks for Gaiden, so that's about how much purely new music there was, but it is out there if you want to find it. It's just not its own soundtrack. I learned that this morning because I was I want to hear the new stuff, so there it is.
Yes. And then in terms of unit directors, we have 4 unit directors for the movie. Fujita Haruka herself. Yamada Naoko was a unit director on this movie, which I did not realize. I believe this then is actually her last credit at KyoAni. I thought that it was her role on Sound Euphonium Chikaido Finale, but she is credited as unit director here. Ota Minoru, unit director, and then Yamamura Takia, also unit director. Obviously, all people who've been at the studio for a long time. One of the only kind of newbies there is Ota Minoru, but even he's been there for a while. He, of course, did a lot of animation work and stuff on the show. And then in terms of music, we have a new ending theme, which is called Amy, sung by Chihara Minori and composed by Kikuta Daisuke, both of whom the same roles that they had on Michishiribe. I like the song quite a bit, but it's no Michishiribe, but it is a nice song.
It's no Michishirube, but I don't think Michishirube would work as the ending to this movie. So, like, I think it's actually a great song for the end of this film. I like it quite a bit.
Yes, it's very good.
Japanimation Station.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description. And remember to check out the Weekly Stuff podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games and everything else on all platforms.
And now, back to the show. Yeah, and so that's the history, and that's the crew that made the film, the movie, the film.
The great movie film, as we might say, because I love this movie, and I love it in so many ways. You know, the first thing maybe to acknowledge is that it has a very bizarre structure in the way that the show itself kind of does too, although making more sense when you consider it an extension of the TV show, because it is basically... this is the only similarity it has with this thing, but it's kind of like the end of Evangelion in that it is structured as 2 45-minute episodes that make up a 90-minute movie. Otherwise, no similarities whatsoever with the end of Evangelion. But that one thing...
this movie doesn't end with Taylor choking Amy out on a beach with like a giant Violet Evergarden head in the background, and she just looks up and tells Taylor that she's disgusting?
It doesn't start with Violet going into Benedict's room and doing something bad? No. Yeah. Anyway, so it's got
Benedict's already doing something bad in his room. You see those boots. He's got something going on.
Sean, I thought of you so many times during this movie because there are multiple full widescreen beautiful shots of Benedict and his twink boots, and I was like, Sean must be loving this, because I didn't even really pick up on it on the show. I mean, it was my first time through, and they are not as prominently featured as they are in the movie. In the movie, you can just tell Fujita Haruka is like, people picked up on this and liked it, so we are going to go all in, and there are just multiple shots from the back, just like full on, of the big boots, and they are spectacular. And Benny, I think, comes into his own as a character in this movie in a big way. But I love the structure of this, and I think doing it as a 2-act call and response, the first part being basically a bigger episode of a Violet Evergarden TV show. Already I'm loving it, because you're basically taking the kinds of episodes I loved most from the show and doing it with even more length, with even more beautiful animation, with this widescreen aspect ratio, you know, all these things. It's just, oh my God, this is great. And if it were a 45-minute short film, I'd be, perfect. That'd be a great OVA. But then it does have its second half, which is this response where there's a bunch of cool things that happen. We jump 3 years into the future, so we're way beyond where we were in the show. We see the world evolving. We see Violet and her friends in a fairly, different phase in their lives. Things have settled in a different way. And then we get to see how those events kind of echo out into now. And it's lovely. And I like that the movie, and I think this is true of a lot of KyoAni movies, and I think it's something they're really good at, doesn't feel the pressure to be like a movie in like the big sense of like Violet has to disarm another bomb and she loses an arm again and all of that stuff. It is just the same kind of thing you would get on the TV show. And what is cinematic about it is the level of care and effort and attention and the shape of the screen and all of those things and the amount of time you're able to spend with these emotions, with these characters. And when I say it's my favorite Violet Evergarden thing so far, that's why. And I love that, and I think this is true of a lot of their movies, is their view of cinematic is that sort of thing. Tamako Love Story isn't telling a more dramatic, it's more dramatic, but it's not telling like a crazier story than the TV show. It's just more in-depth in terms of the filmmaking and the time you spend with it, and same logic and idea here, and man is it good.
Yeah, and it's something that's very cool specifically about this movie is it just feels comfortable being at the same scope, generally speaking, as the show. The biggest thing it does, outside of just it's longer, right? Because if you take the two halves, and it is split exactly in half, it is 45 minutes, 45 minutes, it is very much that structure. So obviously each half is longer than an episode. The only other thing that feels like it sort of takes the privilege of being a movie to do beyond the aesthetics is push the timeline forward to this kind of like more advanced, you see the way the technology has changed. You get different character designs for most of the characters. The Violet is unchanged, which is appropriate. Like Violet shouldn't change. And yeah, like I'm with you that I really like that. I like that this movie is very comfortable to be a like sort of big full-throated version of the TV show and not trying to be something different than what the TV show is. And it gives you the same kinds of pleasures that the TV show gave you, just with more care and attention being able to pay to very particular details because of the amount of love and time that gets to be poured into just this 90-minute movie, as opposed to a 13-episode TV show with a 35-minute OVA, which is a lot more runtime, obviously. And yeah, there's just so much thought and care that goes into every little piece of this movie. Like, as with everything we've been doing on this podcast season, I've been going through and doing my screenshots for my notes. And this movie just has so many fantastic little visual details sprinkled all throughout it. It's definitely the kind of movie that is incredibly rewarding on a rewatch experience, because there's so much to kind of unpack. The way that there are different kinds of visual motifs, like the motif of the birds that shows up, and it shows up at the very beginning, and then also shows up even around the middle, and then it shows up again at the end. The way that like color is used and the sky is used. Violet's stuffed doll, her little dog, and there's a lot of stuff with like the different stuffed animals, because both the sisters have a stuffed bear. And there's just like lots of little things like that are packed in details, like the flowers, and there's a lot of little storytelling details with like what flowers are where, because most of the story for the first half takes place in the kingdom of Drossel, which is where the princess from episode 5 was from, with the white flowers. And so that visual motif is here throughout the film in different ways. Like, there's just so much care and attention packed into every single frame, both in terms of those little details, and then also just generally in terms of the composition, and then the way that characters act and react are expressed, the way that light plays off of them, the way that hair is animated, where you have two very luscious scenes about dressing up hair that are just unbelievably gorgeous. There's also that aspect of like there are so many cool parallels between the two halves, of where Violet has similar scenes with each sister. Each sister sees their other sister through the prism of Violet Evergarden. Like, there's just a lot of stuff like that this movie is so careful and kind of immaculate in terms of detail. And that's something that I think Fujita Haruka is especially good at. It's something you see in terms of the direction in episode 8 of Sound Euphonium, which is when we really first took note of her as a director. It's also obviously like a thing with Ishidate Taichi as a director as well. And we'll see this, I know for sure, in the movie next week, but we've seen that in his episodes, that there's a very like detail-oriented kind of approach that is part of, I think, the fundamental design and aesthetic of Violet Evergarden as a work of art. And you see it on display here through Fujita's hand in so many ways, and it's incredible. Absolutely.
Can I nerd out about widescreen for a minute?
Yes, go ahead. Because this is a movie that is worth nerding out on widescreen about, because yes, it is so good, and you notice this stuff more than I do, but I definitely paid more attention to it here, partially because I had already seen the note about this was, I looked up the history of it and the decision to move to this, and this being the first KyoAni production like this. But yeah, it is incredible.
Yeah. So quick history lesson on basically what we're fucking talking about with all the widescreens, because I know some people don't just pick up on this, and that's totally fine if you're not a nerd about it. But you basically have 3 aspect ratios that are major ones in anime, certainly, and in most global film. And you have the original, like, 4:3, which is the squarish shape. You have 185:1 or 178:1 for TV, which is 16:9. And then you have what we call anamorphic widescreen, which is 239:1, which is also called scope sometimes. And of course, like in the like pre-2000s days of anime, you would have to have a change between movies and TV shows, because TV shows were 4:3 and movies were 16:9. So something like, Gundam on TV is 4:3, Char's Counterattack is 16:9, and you would have to make those adjustments. But, since anime on TV moved to 16:9, just kind of everything is at that aspect ratio. There are slight differences. Movies are 185:1, TV shows are 178. That is more of a meaningful difference than you think it is just from the number, but it is largely the same, shape of the screen. But if you go back far enough, like pre-Osamu Tezuka and Astro Boy, you did have the Toei Doga movies, like Horus, Prince of the Sun, like Animal Treasure Island, or Flying Phantom Ship. All of those movies Toei Animation made that Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki and Yasuo Otsuka and the whole Studio Ghibli crew and the whole TMS Entertainment crew, the people who went and made Lupin the Third, all cut their teeth on that, and those were done in scope widescreen. That's actually to connect to our last Japanimation Station season, Sean, why the Lupin the Third pilot film is in scope widescreen.
Right.
Is yes, because all those people worked there, and if they were going to make Lupin as a movie at that time, that's how you would have done it. And Japan has a really rich tradition. They are the best national cinema at doing widescreen, not because there is something weird going on in the DNA of Japanese people. It is because Japan has a vertically integrated film structure, and when studios like Toho and Toei owned their own movie theaters, they had big widescreen screens that they invested in, and they told all their filmmakers, you shoot like this. And so they got, and the filmmakers who were around at the time were people like Akira Kurosawa. So they got really good at it really fast. And so it has this whole tradition, and when it came time to do big animated movies, it was on that canvas. The thing is, when you're shooting for widescreen, and remember, until you get to digital, animated movies are shot. They're not shot like a normal movie. They're shot one frame at a time, but you have to have a camera and you have to have a lens and you have to do all of that. And 4:3 and 16:9 are photographed with essentially the same lenses onto the same kinds of film strips. Most movies that are 185:1 still will have stuff above and below the kind of boundary, and those are what we would call matted out by the projectionist, or cut out in a digital print, and it is there, and so that's how you make widescreen that way. But when you're doing 239:1, you'll still put it on the same reels of 35mm, but instead of cutting off the top and bottom, it literally is taking a wide image and squeezing it onto the film strip, and so you have to have a different lens both to capture that and then to project it, and that is why it was only big budget Toei movies that were doing it. And once the Osamu Tezuka revolution kind of comes around and we're doing stuff on TV, that goes by the wayside because that is a budgetary expense that nobody has time for. And so there are really no major, other than some experiments here and there, anime movies in 239:1 until you get to digital animation again. And then in the last 10 years, we've kind of had an explosion, because when it's all digital and you're scanning it into the computer, you don't have to worry about the camera, the lenses, any of that. And you don't have to worry about the physical paper restrictions quite as much, because you're doing a lot of stuff in the computer, right? Or at least dealing with all of that can be done more easily, especially if you're animating onto a tablet or something, and there's all sorts of ways people do this. And so you've had stuff like, I think really the first out of the gate was the third of the new EVA movies back in 2012 was done this way. And then there've been a lot more. Jujutsu Kaisen Zero was done this way. Makoto Shinkai's most recent movie, Suzume, was done this way. So there've been a couple that have been doing this. And it's impressive when it's done, because this is the biggest thing I think people maybe don't, and I include some professionals in this, don't understand, is that anamorphic widescreen is really, really, really hard to shoot in or to compose for well. It's easy to do it lazily, and I think, if you want an example of lazy anamorphic widescreen, go watch basically any Marvel movie, other than a couple of them. Those are all movies that should probably just be 16:9. They're shot in 239:1, and they're basically a lot of close-ups that wind up, because when you do a close-up in 239:1, the human head is not that shape. You just end up with a lot of dead space. It is really demanding to compose for. And there's a lot of modern live-action movies, because it's just kind of the default for Hollywood that does that. You have to be doing a lot to fill. When you think about how much space that is, it's a lot of space left to right, and it doesn't have a lot of height. So you can't do kind of height-width compositions the way you can with 16:9, and that becomes tough. This movie, Violet Evergarden Gaiden, I think you could teach this movie for cinematography, even though a camera was not used in its production, or at least for composition, because it is a real masterclass at framing for anamorphic widescreen, particularly in the use, I think, of two things it does, is leading lines, which are geometric things within the frame that sort of guide your eye across, and this movie has a ton of good geometric leading lines, and it's literally from the first scene. I knew you were going to get screenshots, but just so I would have it for myself, I took photos of every shot in the first like 5 minutes of this movie, because the opening scene on the boat where you have the character, we don't know her yet, but we'll really realize later this is Taylor coming into the town to meet Violet. Like literally the first shot is the seagulls flying with their wings outstretched. That is a series of leading lines telling you look left to right. And then you have the ocean and the horizon, and it's one of those John Ford compositions, horizon at the top, and that is a big line across the screen that's showing you horizontality. And then you have like the waves cutting through under the boat. That is a leading line across the screen. When you have there's several things on the boat where like Taylor is leaning against like the frame on the edge of the boat, and that is this big long line across the screen. You have lines intersecting. When you get to the castle later on, you will have a ton of these, and they'll be building these up. And there's a bunch of really good geometric, the kind of things you would see a lot in Kigami Yoshiji episodes, honestly. Yeah. But you're seeing here in full, 239:1 widescreen. And what those leading lines are good for and necessary in a movie like this is teaching you to watch horizontally, left to right, which is not going to be as important in 16:9 because you're also going to be dealing with height. You're not really dealing with height at this aspect ratio. So you kind of have to teach the audience how to look laterally on that horizontal axis, and then that means you also have to fill that axis with a lot of stuff. And so the other thing I think this movie is really teachable at is frames within frames, where you're expanding the space of the frame and giving you a real sense of that scope and size by doing things like placing characters within sort of boxes within the frame. I'm just looking through your screenshot, Sean. There's an early shot where we first meet Amy or Isabella, and she's in her room, and she is framed by her 4-poster bed, which looks like kind of a square shape, and then there's this whole other half of the frame that is the rest of her bedroom that is kind of dark and empty. Right after that, you have a shot of Violet against a stained glass window that becomes a frame within a frame. At the very end of the movie, the penultimate shot is Taylor at her window, and she is in the far right of the frame, and the windows are always a frame within frame. There's a scene in the first half, I know, where they are in Violet and Isabella are framed against all these big mirrors, so you literally have the frame split in half between the characters and their reflections. And it can be also as simple as like in the bathtub scene where Isabella asks Violet to come bathe with her. You have Isabella on one half, and Violet is beyond, to make a Taichi Ishidate pun, she's beyond the boundary of the room, and she's beyond the wall, and so the other room is its own frame within a frame. And these are all things you can do to really make use of that widescreen format. And so I know this is nerdy, but like those are when I say like compositionally, this movie is like doing so much with that space. That's what it's doing. And it's really filling it and making you feel like this is a bigger format. That's when widescreen is done well. It shouldn't feel like you've taken a 16:9 image and cut the top and bottom off, which is what it looks like technically on a 16:9 display, which is how we're all watching it now on TV. It should feel like you took the image and made it way bigger in every direction, especially laterally, horizontally. And this movie, like more than basically any animated movie that's done this, other than some of like the old Toei ones, or maybe the Eva movies, because I think Ano and his crew are really smart at this, and they are cinephiles who know how to do this. Like, I think Jujutsu Kaisen Zero looks great. I don't think it's doing, like, this level of, like, oh my god, they did their fucking homework. This looks like a movie with that widescreen frame.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things they're doing is, because I agree, all that stuff, it's something that, like, jumped out to me was something like the geometric quality of the framing, especially because it fits with like the location of the castle, and then also then the city for the second half of the movie, and then that's contrasted with a couple of key moments in nature, particularly the end of the movie, and you see how that sort of changes. But one of the other big tools, and this is something that comes from the TV show as well, that this team is just so ridiculously good at, is color and the simulation of lighting artistically in animation. And that's the other thing that they use to help lead your eye, instruct you how to see the image and break it down. You still get like that use of darkness in this show, which is so powerful because like dark is dark in this, and then light is light, and you've got these different kinds of lights that feel so different. So it's like daylight feels very different, and daylight at different times in the day feels dramatically different. And then you've got firelight in the first half, and then you also then have some electrical lights in the city in the second half of the movie because time has moved forward. And the couple of scenes you have in the city at night in the second half, the quality of the light is very different. The quality of the light internally in some of the buildings in the second half feels different because of those electric lights. And it's just one of the things I'm so impressed at with Violet Evergarden is the way in which light, which is just, it's color, it's some like processing effects, obviously, like some of it is like you can use a little bit of computer stuff to help you with some like the atmospheric quality in some images and add some like three-dimensional sort of a sensation of three-dimensionality to the image. But it's obviously they're not like literally simulating light, they're having to draw it and color it in. But the way in which it is done in this show, in the movie specifically, is just incredible. And that does a lot of work to help make the frame very dynamic, to make the frame feel like it's full, but also bringing your attention to the places where it needs to go, and then allowing what is like a big empty space to feel interesting and dynamic in the overall composition. And that's such a big one. Like one of the shots is maybe about like a third of the way through the first half is there's just a shot of multiple sequences where they cut back to Claudia back at home missing his surrogate daughter Violet, and there's one where then it just shows Violet's room, which is empty, and you just have on the left third of the frame her window and just like dusk, the light of dusk coming through the window, and the little dog is there. And it's such a powerful, dramatic looking shot, and so much of it is how the use of color and light is used there with this is very kind of dull image, but there's still a powerful contrast within the dull kind of grays and blacks of the image. And then the one little dog, that's this little color of like brown, and then some of the dynamic geometric shapes of the chair make it this really rich looking shot. And it's just like the movie is like that all throughout. And it really feels to me like Fujita Haruka is the storyboard artist, and then everybody else on the team, in terms of the animators and then the colorists and everybody else, are really taking this opportunity to make a meal out of being able to do something different. And these are all just such talented artists working on this movie that have never really done a movie in this widescreen format before, or done any project in this widescreen format. And it feels like they're like, let's make the most out of it. Let's really think about how do we do this? How do we take advantage of this process? How do we make this something that's essential to the look of this film? And the end result is so incredible. And it's one of the reasons why I think on rewatch, I love this movie. I loved the movie originally, but I just liked it so much more watching it through this time, is I do think just seeing it on Blu-ray, the composition and the visual imagery of this movie is so crisp and gorgeous that getting to see it in a higher quality format makes the movie like come to life even more.
100%. And I'm glad you cued in on the lighting, because that is just another thing. Like lighting can be this really, sculptural aspect of composition where it has this, kind of physical presence across the screen. And they definitely use it in this movie as something that casts, laterally across the frame and like really creates a dynamic sense of like light as this force moving through the space. And that's something that helps give that sense of the images being really big. And this is where, you already mentioned the coloring. Like this is another place just to, shout out the late Ishida Naomi, because lighting in animation at a fundamental level is a coloring problem. I remember when I was doing research in my dissertation for the movie Ponyo, the Hayao Miyazaki movie, I found an interesting interview where they talked about like Ponyo had an interesting challenge of a lot of it is underwater, and there's a lot of scenes of characters getting wet, and like there are some ways in animation that you would just kind of default to doing that, but they had to kind of rethink it because of the amount of water in the movie, and they realized it's essentially a coloring problem of like how do you color the characters when they're wet versus when they're dry is kind of the biggest part of how you're going to sell that idea, and they had to do a lot of trial and error to figure out what it was going to look like. And I think that's the same thing with lighting, especially if you're going to do it like this where you're trying to think of it in kind of like how would a camera capture light, how does real naturalistic light happen in animation, because saying naturalistic light animation to some degree feels paradoxical, but it's the same kind of thing as if you were to go back in history with painting and be like, Rembrandt is trying to find a way to do naturalistic, very sculptural lighting. There's a reason why in movies you call this kind of chiaroscuro, you sometimes call it Rembrandt lighting, because it's how lighting kind of wraps around faces. And there's a lot of that going on in this movie. And in animation, like that's not 100% color work, but I do think like the primary thing falls on whoever's doing kind of responsible for the coloring, and they do it great. But then obviously there are also things in the layouts. There are, the drawn shadows on characters. There's shots in this movie of like Violet holding a candle lamp, and then the light cast across her and create these three-dimensional shadows. It's wild. And you combine all that with the widescreen, it's just kind of exciting because, Sean, we are, let's see, 29 episodes into the season of our Kyoto Vacation. We have seen most of Kyoto Animation stuff, not all of it, but we've seen like definitely more than half of it. We've seen the majority of it.
Yeah. If you're just looking at ignoring all the stuff they made before they started doing their own original works, we have seen maybe like 80% plus at this point.
And we haven't necessarily, it's been a while since I feel like we've seen them do something totally new, right?
Yeah.
Like, early on, you kind of have the jump from standard definition to high definition. You have, I think, they obviously have to make the HD transition, and that's a little up and down in different places. Their aesthetic kind of, I think, settles into something around Haruhi Season 2, KyoAni, that kind of stuff. But like with this movie, we're getting just straight up, it's widescreen. There's a lot of different things that this is doing, and it's like seeing them kind of reinvent, I think, a lot of their basic ideas is really cool. Especially, I feel like we know what KyoAni looks like to a certain degree, and this feels like it's disruptive in some way, and it made this really exciting to watch.
Yeah, it is. It just feels so fresh visually and so dynamic. And it's just the thing where you look at it, and again, I said this at the top, but it just feels so perfect specifically for Violet Evergarden. And in this movie, obviously the story I think this movie is telling, and some of the locations in this movie make it very appropriate. But the world of Violet Evergarden just feels like it should be at this like ultra wide shot in this ultra wide way. It just feels like it fits the context in the world, and like Violet as this wandering character, the way that you can just make this feeling of like, this ultra wide lens can do a lot of things very particularly. And like one of those things is creating that feeling of distance, and the distance between things and people is so big in Violet Evergarden, both like literally and then metaphorically, right? Like Violet has to travel tremendous distances. She has to literally go somewhere to write a letter, and then people have to go somewhere to deliver it. But it's also then like the metaphysical distance between people in the space in which they occupy. And I think that like that distance can be like harrowing and terrifying and scary and isolating and almost claustrophobic, but that distance can also be kind of beautiful in the way that we can overcome that distance, right? And that's so much of what this movie does, and I think it does it visually so powerfully, leading to the end of the movie where you just have some incredible shots that use that widescreen format and that sense of space and distance, and how that distance can mean different things in different contexts. And so there's the use of this format visually in this film is so laser focused towards the story that it's trying to tell. That's so unique to Violet Evergarden. It's just amazing.
And I think the two parts do it differently. So part one is really about kind of negative space within the image, with like the space that the characters are not inhabiting, and the idea that Isabella is in this really like kind of emotionally desolate space. There's a lot of emptiness in her life. We're using that kind of full frame to show all the extra space around her and how she feels and looks small in it. There's not a lot of like intense close-ups in that first half. There are a lot of shots of her kind of medium close-up, full body, half body, and then the rest of the frame is something else. But then part two, I think, is much more about the possibilities of this format for like discovery and wonder, and like, because you have Taylor who is going out into the world, it's very opposite of Isabella, and she's seeing things and discovering things, and we get a lot of beautiful nature shots, and the idea of like, man, the world is a big place. Even when they're in such a funny scene when they're in the little elevator that is shittier than just using the stairs, there's like a really good shot that uses kind of the equivalent of a wide angle lens for her to be like in awe of the elevator space. And you would never think to use a widescreen format to kind of get that, because an elevator is cramped and vertical, but they find a way to do that. And so it's a very effective way to use both potentialities. There's more than two potentialities, but two kind of extremes of anamorphic widescreen to really give you a sense of where the characters are at. And both of those potentialities happen to be the two things Violet Evergarden is about. So like, it works, as you say, uniquely well for this. Whereas like, I think it would be a weird distraction if KyoAni did this, like, because KyoAni is intimate. It's about four characters hanging out. You want it to be a little bit more balanced in that sense. But this is absolutely perfect.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, that like the first half, it's like the world is big and it being big is scary. In the second half, the world is big and it being big is amazing, right? Yeah. And like Taylor being this little girl who's full of like hope and curiosity, and she looks like this adorable little tiny ball in the frame, right? Like the wideness of the angle, it makes her feel so tiny, because she is literally tiny. She's this little girl with this giant smile, wide-eyed, wandering around, just wanting to be a postman and follow her brother, who becomes her master, and her cool doll friend. And that's like the way in which the movie gets to shift tones and style and use the visual composition to deliver a very different kind of sensation, using the ultra-wide lens. Yeah, it's so cool. In this movie, it's just, the movie just gives so much visual richness on display. It is a good example of a movie that you could really watch with like the dialogue off. You want the music, because the music's so fucking good. But you can learn so much just by looking at it visually and really experience the story visually, because it is so visually rich.
Some Blu-rays do the thing where they have the isolated score track. I wish this movie had that on Blu-ray, where if you could just watch the movie with no sound other than the score. I actually think it would be, a really instructive way to just kind of learn about visuals, but you would also get to really study what Evan Call is doing under it. That'd be great. They should do that. I don't think I've ever seen that on an animated movie, but that would be cool to have. Okay, but you were talking about Taylor and how awesome she is. I think we need to shine a spotlight on our two big guest stars here, who are voiced by two women we know very well here at this podcast. And what a great pair of vocal performances at the heart of this movie.
Absolutely. So we have, continuing our tradition for Violet Evergarden getting big guest stars, and we do have, these are two KyoAni veterans. One in particular is a big KyoAni veteran. So for the first half, we have Isabella/Amy, who is played by Kotobuki Minako, whom we have talked a lot about because she is Mugi in K-On!, everybody's favorite keyboardist. And then she is also, of course, Asuka Senpai in Sound Euphonium. And it's such a great piece of casting, because Amy vaguely looks a bit like Asuka Senpai. Yeah. Like if Asuka was born as a European person, this is what she would look like, right? Yes. Basically, or like Asuka is a Japanese Amy. Like they're so kind of visually similar with the glasses and the hair and stuff. But this character is like if Asuka never got to be herself, right? If she was like truly in that cage seemingly the whole time until the very end of the movie, or you get these little tiny bright moments as her friendship with Violet develops, where this sort of like snarkier, cynical person kind of pokes through, and you get a little bit more of like kind of brightness in the vocals that Kotobuki Minako has. Like she's got this very like cheerful, bright, happy sounding voice to me. Like it's very kind of bubbly, and obviously that's Mugi in a nutshell. And then Asuka Senpai like uses that bubbliness in the voice as a weapon in how she teases everybody around her. And I think like Amy has that same thing. She wants to be this person who's kind of bubbly and teasy and sarcastic, but she can't do that for so much, and so she's so contained. And just getting that little bit through her friendship and how that develops with Violet, it's such a great performance of how well she communicates how boxed in this character is, and the moments where she gets to push out of that box. Then obviously you have the big moment at the end of the movie where she just gets to scream Taylor. That is her like totally liberated. It is such a great performance.
Wonderful performance. Another aspect of it is that the character is like a little bit gender bending in the sense that she uses the masculine pronouns. She says boku. That's really more because she like has this sort of like lower class upbringing, but also like she doesn't, and I think this is a smart thing the movie does, living out away from the royalty, she doesn't have a sense of gender roles. That's not like there's not this like rigid hierarchy where she is out as this like homeless kid just trying to survive. So it is natural she develops this way where she is not caring about femininity or the performance of gender or any of that. So she is using the masculine pronouns, and she has to be reminded of that. And she has kind of a rough speaking style, and that of course evolves over the course of the movie. And I think all of that is really well done too, because you can feel how much like the specific performance of femininity that is thrust upon her in this high society is this thing that just does not come naturally to her, in a way that like Violet, I don't know if she thinks about it that much, but Violet is very good at those things. Like she just can talk the talk and walk the walk and do the waltz and all those things, right?
Yeah.
And I really like that contrast as well. And I think, Kotobuki and Ishikawa as that's their last names, isn't it? I should say
yes.
The other way around. Sorry.
No. Well, it's too forward to just call them Minako and Yui. That's just weird.
Yeah, no. Sorry. Sometimes you have their names in different orders sometimes because it is confusing and the internet does it differently.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I end up copying the actors' names from Anime News Network, which has it in the Western order. So normally, if I'm just writing it off the top of my head, I do it the Japanese order because I'm using on the Japanese sources.
I was correct. Kotobuki and Ishikawa, they are so good together. And I like the interplay between Violet's, like, very proper speaking style that is, like, still has those traces of kind of roboticness, but is very earnest at this point. And then, Amy really struggling with her sort of natural, rougher speaking style and what is expected of Isabella, and all of that through the performance. And the writing is great.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you sort of pointed that part out, because it's something that, obviously the subtitles have a hard time trying to convey, because yes, Amy does use Boku, which is normally that kind of masculine pronoun, which in this context, as you identified, it's because she's a war orphan. Specifically, like it makes her feel like, oh, she's coming from some sort of like rough and tumble upbringing. She's not speaking like a fancy lady. She's not going goki genyo and all that kind of stuff like all the other fancy ladies at the all girls school are doing. And then she slowly has to adopt the watashi, which is a very like proper high class kind of way to refer to yourself, especially if you're a woman. And Violet corrects her on that multiple times as a sort of like pseudo-governess role, but it breaks near the end of the movie when she reads the letter from Taylor. She reverts to Boku for a couple of moments. So yeah, it is like a nice little character detail that is the kind of character detail that's very hard to translate. And it's very good writing and very good performance, because it comes with not just her literally saying the word, but the quality of the voice shifts obviously with that as well. She's kind of code shifts in those moments. So that's Amy. And then we also have for the second half, and then, for little moments in the first half, we have our other co-star here. We have Taylor Bartlett, voiced by Yuki Aoi, who we have talked about a lot, of course, Futaba in Persona 5. I've very recently just finished watching The Apothecary Diaries, and she plays Mao Mao in that show. And it was another one where I watched it, I'm like, oh my God, she is really good. Like, she is really, really, really good at this. She's good at this in any capacity. She's like really fucking good at being the main characters in those kinds of shows. It's crazy. But then, of course, for our purposes, we've talked about her recently because she's Yuzuru, the younger sister, in a silent voice, which is another just incredible performance. And here we're getting a slightly different version of Yuki Aoi, where we're getting the little kid version, which is awesome. Like, she's very good at playing little kids. She's been very good at playing little kids since she was a little kid, because she started as a child actress. There's some old anime or old, like mid-2000s anime where she was a kid and was playing main characters and stuff. And she is just preternaturally good at this shit. It is crazy. It is like almost unsettling how good she is at playing just any kind of character. But this character in particular, Taylor, it's so powerful because it's the kind of thing where it wouldn't, I think, work particularly well if you wanted to do the kind of Ghibli thing of casting an actual kid to play Taylor. Taylor's like goes through, I think, a little bit too much of a complicated emotional journey. She's
also so heightened as a character.
Yes.
Like, she is pretty out there. There's a lot of comedy demands. Like, the Ghibli thing is for like Chihiro in Spirited Away, where you want a naturalism that implies the character is not fantastic. Taylor is kind of fantastic. She's a girl who runs away from an orphanage because she wants to be a postmaster. It's, crazy.
Yeah, and there's just something you want, like, through, like, it's like the little moments of when she says, like, Amy under her breath to herself, that you need a more experienced actor, I think, to try to deliver those moments if that's what you're trying to do with this character. And it's just such an incredible performance, because you get her all the way from her being seeming like maybe like 3 years old or something in the war flashbacks, to the point where she can't really remember it. And the only thing she can say is like nene and little like things like that. And then all the way to her being this rambunctious little 8-year-old kid who's running around all the place, is illiterate and has a hard time pronouncing things. I love the scene early in the second part where she tries to say Violet Evergarden and just can't say it. Because to be fair, trying to say Violet Evergarden in Japanese is very hard. It's extremely cool if you say it well, but it is also very complicated because V is not a sound that exists in Japanese. So you have like the Violet Evergarden.
It's hard to spell. It's a really hard katakana to go through.
Yeah, it's a complicated name, and so having her kind of like struggle over pronouncing it, and then being able to do it at the end of the movie the last time she sees Violet, and it's just, you get this real full sense of this little kid who has this wide-eyed optimism, but there is this, you know, deeper sadness underneath it that she's struggling with. And just getting all the sides of this character and how good she is at making this kid feel like a kid, feel incredibly young. It's so heartbreaking in those moments where, like, in the flashback, Amy's walking away from her and she's just screaming nay nay after her. All those aspects of playing a little kid, she just does unsettlingly well. It's like it's
Yes.
almost disturbing how good she is at this stuff.
Well, because she sounds really authentically childlike,
Yes.
but with a sense of comic timing and emotional precision that you would only get from a seasoned professional voice actor.
Yes.
And when someone can do those two things, and there are a lot of, you know, Japanese actors who are very good at that intersection, she's particularly good at that intersection. And so, yes, it really makes that second half of the movie come alive. Because this is also a pretty different character than we got on the TV show, where, like, Taylor is outwardly funny in a way that I think we talked about in the show, that the show doesn't really, it's funny sometimes, doesn't really do gags. There are some actual gags with Taylor because she's a funny kid. Like the thing in the elevator is the best joke in the whole series so far, of Violet getting out of the elevator and going, it probably would have been easier to take the stairs. That's not really a Taylor joke, but around that scene is also where, like, she's like eyeing the boy who gets the candy, and then the cutaway is to her sucking a lollipop and going, man, he could really tell how much I wanted this, couldn't he?
Yeah.
You know? And just all those things. Taylor is very full of life, and that life sometimes is sadness as well. But, you know, just seeing, like, how excited she is to do the post office stuff, which is also kind of fun because that half the movie is set several years later. So all the characters we know from the show are at this point old hat at this. You know, they've been doing this for a while. And so there's a little bit maybe of almost cynicism that has set in. And then Taylor comes in and is like, wow, you're delivering letters? This is cool. And I kind of like how Benny especially warms up at that. It's great.
Yeah, there's just, it's such a great character and performance, and in particular there's a lot of care given to her smile, because there's so many scenes where she just has this big toothy grin that's so childlike, she does the thing that, like, little kids do. They sort of bring, optimism and that kind of different perspective into your life when you're a withered old husk of a once human being, which we all are now, at the ripe old age of 30 plus. And it is, like having these little kids running around and being all crazy, and for them everything is new. It is really sort of empowering, and it's something that, it brings us very different energy. And you're right, it has a wildly different energy than any of the stuff in the TV show. Not in the sense that it's like, it feels like it's outside the scopes of what Violet Evergarden could do. It's just that the only time we had a little kid in the TV show, we had Anne, and that's Anne has a little bit of Taylor to it, but that's a much sadder story.
Yes.
So it's there's obviously a lot of the stuff in Taylor's past is sad, but there's nothing has happened that can't be to a certain extent undone. They can always meet each other again. There's hope, in that sense of like a reunion. Obviously for Anne, there's a different kind of hope, and there's a different kind of brightness around that story. But she's lost her mom, and so it has a different kind of energy to it.
Well, and while Taylor has been separated from her big sister, she was put in a nice orphanage where she is well fed and cared for. So it's sad, but it's like also what Amy did is incredibly selfless and did probably save this kid's life in the long run, because who knows how long they could have kept going on the streets for. So yeah.
And that's one aspect of this movie I do really love, is you have two kinds of big tropes that the two halves move through. Which the first half is this is literally the origin of Yuri manga and all that kind of stuff, of the same sex. It's not Catholic school here, but in actual manga, it's like a Catholic school in Europe. This is like in the 70s. This is where all that stuff, like boys love Yuri manga, it all comes from these settings. But those tropes always come along with much more kind of intense subject matter of girls throwing themselves off of chapels, steeples, and drug addiction and blackmail and cults and all kinds of sordid shit that goes on in those manga. And you've got the blonde girl in the first half, where if it was one of those, she would be secretly a murderer or some shit, or she'd be spreading lies and behind Amy's back and all those kinds of things. But she's actually a really good kid who just wants to be friends. In the second half, you've got the orphan kid, and you have the one little scene with the nun in the orphanage just reading Taylor the letter, and she's like, can you read the letter again? And she just starts reading it again. And it's like, oh, good. Like, they're just good people, because the cliche more would be, this orphanage, it's run by some like money-grubbing Ebenezer Scrooge bastard, and the nuns are all kind of cynical, and they put on a good face, but they're like beating the kids secretly. Like, that's so much of what this kind of Victorian European fiction is, especially in manga. Like it's so much kind of where, when you go to this setting in a lot of Japanese fiction, it goes to those places so often that it's nice. We talked about this in the first, talking about the TV show. It's nice that Violet Evergarden has this very optimistic outlook on humanity, that like most people are very good people. You've got that weird one colonel guy who doesn't really work as a character in the TV show, but everybody else, even if they make mistakes or they can be kind of a jerk sometimes, it's all comes from a place of them being fundamentally good. And I love that about this movie, that you've got these spaces of where the orphanage could be this fucked up place. This all-girls school could be this den of vipers, where like one wrong thing said means that your entire social life crumbles around you. And bad things have happened to these people. There was the war, all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, like, the world is full of good people in this show. And you feel it, I think, very potently in this film.
Yeah, it could be a Charles Dickens novel, and it is not. Right? KyoAni, now I want to see KyoAni's version of Oliver Twist that is like much more mild and no one's really that bad. That would be interesting. It would probably be more interesting than the actual book, which is like 1,000 pages. But anyway, no, and I agree completely, and I love it. And, I like the sense, because it's not just that people are good, but it's that people are resilient and that people adapt, I think is a big theme of Violet Evergarden, because it's literally about a society adapting to something horrible that has happened on a societal level and then a bunch of people individually. Like, Taylor is okay. She's got some scars. She's sad about the sister leaving, but like, that's a damn good kid. When she shows up at the office, Bennett's a little annoyed for understandable reasons, because he's having to do a lot more work. But like, everyone's like, man, this kid is cool. This is awesome. Violet eventually adopts her as a younger sister, which is the coolest plot point in this movie. And even Isabella and Amy, it's sad, but I think you also get the sense that like Isabella, in that when we see her at the end, has learned to adapt. Although I do think the big thing of finally getting word from Taylor, you can get the sense will allow her to live in this new life much more freely, and that is very crucial for her. But even then, like, it is, as you say, this does not end with Amy throwing herself off the balcony because she cannot take the pain anymore. And I am glad that that is not the show Violet Evergarden is. It, gets there in episode 9 when Violet tries strangling herself, and then it rejects that and becomes about resiliency. And I think this movie is absolutely of a piece with that.
Yeah, and nor does it judge Amy for making the choice to leave Taylor behind and all that stuff. Like it understands the reasons why she made that choice. There are negatives to that choice. There are positives to that choice, because who knows, both of them could have easily died a month later if she had not chosen to do that. And it's like, it would be very easy for the story to be like, and it was the worst mistake I ever made. And I like that Violet Evergarden, it is an optimistic show, but it's not an unrealistic show. It has, like, I think, a kind of even-eyed gaze at the world and kind of understanding that, love is not enough to allow you to survive. Like, you need love in your life, and you want love in your life, but that is not going to put food on your table, And so it's nice that it doesn't sort of go down that route either, of kind of looking at Amy as someone who has made this horrible mistake in leaving her little sister behind, because all you need is love. And it knows that it's a lot more complicated than that.
I mean, the show is full of examples of those kind of trade-offs, and it's there from the root of the show in Violet and the Major's relationship, where that is rooted on Violet having been, raised as this soldier, and this is this terrible thing. The Major is, to some extent, complicit in that, but he is also like trying to, within the system he lives in, do as right by this little girl as he can. And those things do pass on, even though as an adult, Violet can clearly understand what is and isn't okay about that. But she also can take to heart the love that came from that. And I think and it's something that I like in all of the kind of standalone Violet Evergarden stories, is they never have to like wink at the audience like, this is a parallel to what happened with Violet in the Major. But they can just trust the audience will draw those lines that, like, why is Violet so empathetic to this scenario? Because obliquely it does mirror her own lived experience. Even though she was never a noble lady and these sorts of things, she can understand this. And, the most you need is that, like, little reference of her touching the brooch on her chest and going, I learned it from someone. And I think that's a kind of moment that resonates, even if this was your first time with Violet Evergarden. You would get like, oh, okay, you get the theme of the movie, that what this is about. And yeah, it's a story that just very much extends from the classic themes of Violet Evergarden, and feels like a very natural extension. I would never have guessed that like half of this is from the author, half of this is from the anime staff. This is one where they're all very simpatico on what this show is about and able to merge it really seamlessly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't feel a dissonance between what's adapted and what's new.
Yeah. And one other thing I want to say about Violet herself is that earlier in the episode I said, these are my favorite kind of Violet Evergarden stories, are the ones that are kind of from the POV of someone she comes to do the job for, and we see the story through those eyes. That's not because I have any less liking or dislike for the ones that are really about Violet as a character. It's because I think Violet is so perfect in this archetypal mode we talked about in the episode about the TV show, where she is so fascinating when she comes in from the outside and we see her through the outsider's gaze. She is so compelling on that level. And I think part of the secret sauce of Violet Evergarden as a show is it does both sides. So that when you do the stories that are about a different POV character, you have the information about Violet as a human from the episodes that are more from her POV, and you can kind of play those off of each other. But she just is that kind of character, like Doctor Who or something, where it's really fun to see the episodes where it is someone who didn't know this person before gets a new view on her. We get to see her from a new vantage point, and it just speaks to what a tremendous character she is. And this movie, we get to do it twice and contrast those and have all of those scenes you mentioned earlier, like the bathing scene, the hair scene, the sleeping together scene, that kind of we get to play off these two women, these two sisters, and their parallel experiences with Violet. And so even though Violet is at a more of a distance in this movie than in like the final few episodes of the TV show, she's still the engine that makes it work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's go through some of those moments. It kind of break down some of those big scenes, because there's a lot of really amazing just scenes that are so juicy in this movie. And looking at part one, there's just some really nice imagery in part one that where you've got Amy gives her whole kind of little speech at the beginning, or narration at the beginning, about seeing Violet for the first time, but it's also about the sense of her living in this prison. And so you do have this opens with this shot once Violet gets there, going in and closing the gates, and the gates are like these bars, and at the end of part one, Violet leaves and the gates shut behind her, and Amy is stuck there staring out from the other side of those bars. And so there is this sense of her being imprisoned, which doesn't get fully, I think, unleashed until you get to the very, very end of the movie, where finally it feels like she is actually free. But there's a nice framing device for part one around those bars and the imagery of her being in this prison, this giant castle that is full of these rich people, but is not the world she wants to be in. But for most of part one, you get, all these little moments and scenes of Violet being this governess. And I love this stuff. It's so fun. This is the most, what feels like an episode of the TV show, where you have the little bit of the classic, oh, we're going to put the book on your head and you have to balance it and all that stuff. And then there's a shot of Violet just standing there with her hands kind of together, and she's got 6 books on her head, just perfectly balanced. She's always by Amy's side, this kind of perfect, stoic figure. And you just get a lot of the fun cliches of this kind of story that I just love. This shit of the all girls school, and here's the one kind of masculine coded woman who everybody swoons over because they're a knight. This is where you feel very acutely, for me, how much Violet Evergarden looks like Saber from the Fate Stay Night series.
Yes, I'm glad you said that.
If she just had one ahoge, one big piece of hair sticking up over the top, she would look exactly like Saber. Because there's a way in which all these other women at this school look at Violet and they swoon over her and all this kind of stuff in the way that Violet is, like lightly masculine coded. Obviously, she is also still very feminine, but within this all-girls school, she carries herself like a gentleman. And that's like kind of, I think, what a lot of them are responding to, and also what Amy responds to. And all those little pieces are so fun. Just kind of the procedural aspect of it. It's a little bit cliche in that way that you want, that it invests you into this kind of genre of fiction that exists obviously outside the scope of Japanese fiction. Like it is from the contemporaneous period of the Victorian era that it's referencing, but there is such a rich tradition of Japanese fiction set in these kinds of schools that it is fun to see the Violet Evergarden kind of take on that stuff.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Just as the basic, as you say, the procedural elements of Violet's job, I love all that. I love just every time we get reminded that, like, Violet is preternaturally good at everything she does, right? Like, she can balance the books, she can talk, she can type, she's just always good at these things. She doesn't brag about it or anything, but I like the little bits of annoyance from Isabella, like, God damn it, my governess is good at everything, But then she also, I think, admires her for it, and I love all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it also just reminds me of like one of the cool things about the dolls as this fictional construct is it feels like this really well considered, interesting job that one part of it is being a person who writes letters. The other part of it is being this very elegant, trained woman that's beautiful writing these letters, right? It's so built into the setting of that all the dolls are women, they're all very beautiful and gorgeous, and they have this like training in courtesy and all that kind of stuff that makes it feel very real. It makes it feel so historically grounded, like it's a thing that could have actually existed. And that aspect of the two different roles that these women play, both their sort of like the letter of their job, writing down the letters, but also there's the aesthetic presentation of the job. And you see all of that in episode 3 of the TV show where, yes, she's training on how to type, but it is like going to a governess school. It is like that kind of aspect that you are this, broadly speaking, lower class woman who is interfacing with this much higher class world most of the time. That's what we see mostly the dolls being used. And that comes with it this certain kind of almost chivalric, courtly kind of aspect to the job as well. And that's where you see all of it come in handy here, because, the overall premise of the first part of the movie is that Violet has been hired on as effectively this like handmaiden / governess to this girl through her connection to the Drossel royal family, which is the princess from episode 5. So it's like that is the connection of why Violet ends up here, even though it's not, on the face of it, it's not a thing that an auto-memory doll should have to do.
That's something... I was just going to say, that's something I love also, is the continuation of the theme that her clients are constantly asking her to do things outside of her fucking job description, including go spend 3 months as a governess. That's not an auto-memory doll thing, but Violet Evergarden is a jack of all trades. I like that, like, very few of her jobs are to actually do her normal job.
Yes, but part of it comes with the implication that, like, fundamentally training to be a doll is also training to be all these things that this girl has to become. And that, like, that is part of culturally what these things are, this occupation is. And I think it's cool because it just adds a lot of flavor to the world. And again, it just makes it feel very historically grounded, because if this occupation actually was a real thing, it probably would have been like this. It would be kind of like being a courtesan or a geisha. Like if you're a courtesan, part of your job is having sex, but really part of your job is being an entertainer and being able to talk and being able to dance and play music and be able to, be this kind of very elegant, high-class figure. And an auto-memory doll is like that. It's just, instead of writing sex, the technical job is you're writing a letter. Yeah,
absolutely. Now I am thinking, though, Sean, because you made the Saber connection, the chivalric knight connection, I think we need to get Ufotable and Kyoto Animation to collaborate on a Fate Stay Night crossover where it's in the world of Violet Evergarden. They have the Holy Grail War, and we have Violet Evergarden summon Saber and have that connection. I think that'd be pretty good.
No. It would be, it's a Holy Grail war, and Violet gets summoned as a servant because her mark on history is so profound.
Yes.
That she's like a writer or something, Rider writer.
Yes, but she is writer. She is Writer.
Yeah, and her Holy Grail, or sorry, her Noble Phantasm would be ripping out her typewriter and typing like the most amazing letter you've ever seen in your life, and it just makes everybody cry, and just, you know, everyone just sort of gives up and becomes friends, and that's how the Holy Grail war ends. It's like, why don't we just share it? You know, it's fine.
I like imagining what the Kyoto Animation version of Fate Stay Night would be. Just very different.
It'd be very pleasant. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Anyways, back to this movie. So there's a couple of other really juicy scenes to talk about here, because there is an element here. It's not as sort of intense as we get it in Sound Euphonium between Kumiko and Reina, but there is a homoerotic quality to the all-girls school and Amy and Violet's relationship, right? And you feel it most directly in the bathing scene, which is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Like, it's just so well shot. It's so intimate and so powerful. And seeing this scene between these two girls, neither of whom really know what it is to have a friend, right? Or at least Violet doesn't know that Violet knows what it is to have a friend. I do have to say, I feel kind of bad for Luculia, who is Violet's actual first friend.
Yes.
That Violet says to Amy, like, you're the first person to ever call me a friend. I'm like, well, maybe Luculia never used that exact word in front of you, but like Luculia absolutely was your friend in episode 3. That was your first friend. But for the purposes of the story, there's these two women who both come from actually very similar backgrounds, both of whom are very kind of emotionally removed from home, like social relationships. They've never had a romantic relationship. They've never had really much of a friendship before. And seeing Amy's sort of trying to figure out what is this connection she has with Violet. And again, it's not, I wouldn't like go super far as I would as with like the Reina stuff. It's not as sexualized as that, but it's baked into this kind of story that there is this boundary between what is a friendship and what is like a romantic connection between these two women, and the intimacy that develops between Amy and Violet as Amy like is, you know, coughing up in the middle of bed, and then Violet comes down and has to rub her back. There's such a focus on the mechanical hands and all of that as well that are so prominent here, more so I feel like they are in other episodes, because there's so much of like her having to comfort her, hold her hand when she's waking up, all of that. And it kind of culminates in their private moments in that bathing scene of the both of them, with Violet sitting on the hem of the tub and Amy in the middle of it, and both of them sort of sharing furtive glances at each other, but not really knowing what to do. And then they both get in bed together. And that's when Amy has her kind of nightmare and memory of being with Taylor. And there's just such a warmth and intimacy between these two girls as they sort of slowly connect over this. And the way those scenes are shot and written and played, I just think is gorgeous.
I agree completely, and I actually think this is a good counterpoint to the Sound Euphonium thing, where the Sound Euphonium just has the problem that we've talked about, of that because the story after season 1 doesn't go in the direction season 1 really, 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 really heavily implies. Season 1, some of that stuff winds up feeling a little queerbaity. And then I think in this one, it doesn't. I don't think that is what they're doing at all. I think it's very smart about playing that card, but it is, because it is undeniably about a homosocial bond, right? And I think there's the question of like, how much is there a sort of sexual component to this? Because there is clearly in Amy some discomfort being around another woman intimately, that you could read sexually, you could read otherwise. And I think the whole point of it is that ultimately when you learn about, you know, her past and her trauma, it is about this thing about, you know, she had a little sister, she had this kind of intimate caretaker connection, now she is being taken care of, and that is the thing that is on her mind. So I think it does a very good job of playing the card of, we are exploring a homosocial connection between these characters without ever feeling like it's getting to the level of we're going in a Yuri direction or something like that, right? Which is not what the story is, and so it shouldn't do that visually. And I think it plays all of that really beautifully in a way that reflects the characters and their psyche really well.
Yeah, I feel like, it doesn't go to the point of it feeling queer baiting because I feel like their relationship is not defined enough, even through implication, to go that far. But it is it's playing around the edges of that, right? And again, I think it's just like inevitable material. It is when you have this kind of story about whether it's women or it's men, in this sort of like all same-sex environment, and it's about these two people building a relationship and the growing intimacy within that relationship. It is inevitably going to sort of hover around this sort of boundary of romanticism and sensuality and intimacy and friendship, in that there is a spectrum, right, that all relationships exist on within that space, and they're sort of navigating that. And specifically Amy is, right? Because I think the thing with Violet is, she's, she, I think, cares a lot about Amy, but I don't ever get a sense of a romantic tension coming from Violet's side of things. But there is a sense with Amy looking at Violet that there is a questioning there, because there is the moment when they're in bed together. And I think this is the scene where it ends with Violet, the camera looking up at the stars, and Violet starting to sort of talk about what happened in episode 6. Her saying like, oh, let me tell you about the constellations. I learned all about it when I was at this observatory, because they're talking about the job of an auto memory doll. And within that, the conversation comes around to Violet talking about that it's about conveying to people the feelings that they can't say themselves. And there's a little bit of like lingering on Amy looking at Violet and looking at the lamp, the fire lamp that Violet is holding. And there's like, I think, two things held in that gaze. There is one thing, which is the feeling she feels for Taylor. She can't communicate, which then is paid off in her writing her letter. But I think there's also the feeling she feels for Violet. And like, how does she convey those? Like, where can she kind of like cross that boundary, and how far do those feelings go? And it's just this nice sort of like, underpinning to the emotional foundation of this first half of the story, that feels incredibly well done to me. I think it walks the line it's walking really perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Part and parcel to that is also the dance scene. I don't know if you're...
Well, if you talk about the dance scene, I also just want to talk about the hair braiding scene for a couple of reasons. It's beautifully animated. You see Violet Evergarden with two different hairstyles, which is like viscerally shocking, because Violet is not someone who like changes her hairstyle, obviously, and that is fun. But also like, Kyoto Animation, they're the best in the biz at animating hair. Ishidate Taichi Productions, particularly good at animating hair. And then, of course, this is Haruka Fujita, but working from that, whole style. There's particularly a shot of her, like, braiding Violet's hair from behind and the light breaking in through the window over Violet's hair, where I just can't even begin to quite understand how they do the lighting in that scene and how it, like, refracts on Violet's hair and looks illuminated and glowing. I assume it's a combination of a dozen different techniques, but man, it's a good-looking scene.
Yeah, they sell the effects so much of like where the parts where the hair is a little bit thinner, the light is kind of breaking through it and reflecting off of it kind of internally. And then where the hair is a little bit thicker, the light is absorbed more, so it's darker. And yeah, it looks so good. And there's just a real sense of physicality to it. One part of that also is the sound design is so good, where like the sound of the brushing and fingers going through the hair is so perfect, and you can like feel how different Violet's hair is versus when you have the sort of like mirrored scene with Taylor in part 2, and Violet is doing that for Taylor, and her hair is much more kind of messy and kind of clumped up, and the way the sound is different, it adds such a nice kind of physical texture to it through the sound. But yes, the animation is phenomenal. Seeing like her curling the two kind of tails on Violet's hair to then make the sheep horns, which this is absolutely the most Amy just turns into Asuka Senpai in this movie, to the point where I almost wish that they just straight up had her give Violet the weird Kumiko poof at the bottom of the hair, and just call her Omai-chan for a second, because it's the most that I think Kotobuki Minako lets the Asuka Senpai kind of quality in her voice come through as she's teasing Violet. And then that leads into one of the best little moments in the movie of where because she's playing with Violet's hair so much, they almost end up late to class. So you get this little moment of them running through the pathway that's covered with trees. to the school, and Violet's leading Amy by the hand, and she looks up into the sky and she raises her hand up, which is one of the recurring motifs. It's one of the first shots in the movie is Taylor doing that on the boat. Taylor then does it at the end of the movie as well, reaching up to the sky. It also connects to all the imagery of birds we get. And it's so great because I think it's this, she's still in the prison here, but it's like she's because she's in nature, it gives you a vision of her being able to break out, but it is still within this walled garden, and her reaching up to the canopy of the trees, which you can't actually see the sky beyond, but there's a little bit of light poking through, and the way that like is playing off of this visual motif of people reaching their hand up into the sky, and here the sky is not there yet. It's so far outside of her reach. She's so far removed from everything else. And she's talking about in that moment to Violet, like, why don't we just run away? Why don't we just go somewhere else? We could go anywhere we want to. And then Violet says, no, we're not going anywhere, my lady. Like, we're going to class, because Violet is a very literal person. But it's a beautiful little moment that helps kind of center what is the main emotional tension throughout the film, which is this sense of being trapped and removed from the people you love. And this little tiny moment here, this little connective kind of thread in the film is so potent here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are great scenes. And then you did want to talk about the dance, which is an incredible scene. I feel like we haven't had a good, big Kyoto Animation classical dance scene in a while, but it was one of the first things we ever talked about was in Kanon. Mm-hmm. We spent an inordinate amount of time talking about that dance scene. I definitely got big vibes from that here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one, you just get the fantastic decision to give Violet this weird, sort of half dress, half suit, right? She's got pants, but she also has this big kind of tunic or cloak that goes down and has this huge tail. And then Amy is in what is effectively a red wedding dress, partially because, right, we're in Drossel, so it's all the white flowers are everywhere. And so the color of white is so prominent. But it is, it's very much intentionally, to me, looks like it's a lesbian wedding, right? Where they're both where here Amy is very much the wife, or more traditionally the femme one, and then Violet is in this very interesting space where she's in the middle, right? Where it's some of her dress and some of her behavior is masculinized, but it's also not totally masculine. There's still a lot of femininity to it. She's still in a white dress. She's not in a black tux kind of look or anything like that. It's just such a great, cool little kind of fashion choice, because Violet is also the only person wearing a getup that looks like that. Even though we have seen other women in that handmaiden kind of role for other students, none of them are dressed in the same kind of outfit. And also, the implication is that this was bought for her by Claudia and delivered by Benedict, which is I did not realize that Claudia Hodgins had that level of fucking fashion sense, because there is a moment early on where he is walking past a dress store back in Leiden and stops in it, and that's sort of the setup for this moment. But it's so cool, and the way it's just kind of playing with gender and the aesthetic here. Again, it's very juicy, and it's so, if you like these kinds of girls in the big Catholic school stories and the way that those play out, it's so good. It's such a good version of that kind of story. And then you get this beautiful, gorgeous ballroom dance that's so well animated, that is just, it's so gorgeous, but it also has so much pathos to it, because this is where you get the first kind of statement of this image of the bird that you had at the very beginning of the movie, and that comes up in the second part, because while they're dancing, there's that top-down shot of where they're all kind of circling around, and then you have Amy and Violet, and then Amy looks up and sees there is this mosaic on the ceiling that it looks like the sky with clouds and a couple of birds on there, and there are some shots of her looking up at that in kind of wonder. And it is such an interesting way to inject the story here, right? That it is this moment of levity, it is this moment of joy and connection and intimacy she has with Violet, and the culmination of their relationship, and it's sort of visualized like a wedding. Past this point, she is the next time we see this character, she is married as well, obviously not to Violet, but it is kind of prominently, there's a wedding ring in those other shots in part two. And there's a big contrast in the dress we'll talk about with part 2 as well. And you have all of that and that joy, but at the same time, she's still in the cage. She's still in the prison. She's looking up at the sky and looking up at the birds, but it's not really a sky. It's not really the birds. You know, it is like the Plato's cave, right? She's just looking at the shadows from the fire dancing on the wall. She can't actually see the real sun. And it's such a beautiful, bittersweet moment in the story that's so touching to me.
Absolutely. This was the one scene from Violet Evergarden that I had kind of seen going into this project because it is very prominently featured in the trailer for this movie, and I had to use trailer material when I edited the theme song for Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation, which by necessity, I couldn't have seen everything yet when I made that theme song, so I was using other like theme songs from the shows. I was using trailers from the movies and all of that footage, and they definitely made this the centerpiece of the film's marketing in the trailers for Violet Evergarden Gaiden. Like, I do wonder how much that resulted in the movie being a big hit. Is that it does promise you a big juicy scene with a kind of masculinized Violet dancing with this girl. It looks really interesting, and it is spectacularly animated. So I knew this was coming. I kind of forgot if it was from the I don't think I wound up using it in the theme song because the aspect ratio is too extreme to crop. And I wound up using the dance scene from Kanon in that spot instead, which was more in the shape that we were using in our theme song. But like, I knew this was coming. I was very curious the context. It comes here. It's a great scene for all the reasons you described. In terms of the technical qualities of the animation, it is the thing that I think is there in Kanon, and, almost 20 years later, they're even better at, which is the sheer weight of the human beings. The feeling that these are not, weightless drawings on paper, but people who move with momentum and weight. Their hair moves with momentum and weight. They are affected by the movement of each other's bodies and by their surroundings. It is so physical and so tactile. And when you're talking about that kind of charge between them, however you want to read it, that is where it comes from. And it is such an interesting, different scene for Violet, because that being kind of a scene I had seen, there isn't quite a moment like this in the TV show, which kind of colored my interpretation of Violet. I was wondering if they were going to do a little bit more like gender-bending material with Violet in the show. This is obviously the biggest place where they have done that yet. I don't know about the next movie. But it is fascinating, and it is really, really beautifully done. Particularly, I do think, for how it connects that theme of the birds in the sky. It's something Kyoto Animation from their first movie to now is very good at picking a couple of little visual motifs that will carry throughout the feature. And of course, and with this one, it is the birds. And I think doing that as the painted bird on the mural ceiling is both beautiful and heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's just, it makes that scene is like, it's so rich with meaning, right? It's like, yes, you do get like the very beautiful dancing, but there's all this other stuff going on alongside what is being communicated with just the dancing. And especially it's even richer on a rewatch when you know that there's like the bird stuff and all that. Some of the shots at the end of this movie I remembered so vividly that when I got to them, I was like, oh my God, oh, okay, shit, the birds, because I did not remember that part of the dance scene, and I saw that bird thing, I'm like, okay, yes, no, the sky, the birds, yes, I see what you were doing, movie, and it is very good.
Absolutely. Anything else to say about part one? There's also obviously the flashback, which is beautifully done, very in line with, I think, the images of the war that we have seen so far. This is a little different. We're obviously more in a wintry landscape. There is one shot. I had also seen this shot before because it came up in like people posting favorite Kyoto Animation backgrounds when I was researching earlier this season. There's a landscape that is of this like lake in winter, and there are all these wintry mountains around it, and there's kind of an outcropping that juts out into the lake, and it's only on screen for a couple seconds, but you could absolutely put that in a museum as just an amazing landscape painting, and it would sell for thousands of dollars. It's just unreal. And of course, Violet Evergarden throws off backgrounds like that like they're fucking nothing, because it's just all over this show. But that is one of my favorites, and I do think that entire winter setting, it feels of a piece with the other hints of the war we've gotten, but particularly extreme and squalid for people on the ground. Because obviously when we see it with Violet, she's a combatant. She is not a civilian trying to live day to day.
Yeah, those flashback scenes are really powerful. And you just get a lot of good setup of imagery that's going to recur through part two, right? Because this is kind of like your transition in many ways to part two, because you then get like some of the snowman stuff, which comes up. You've got the bubbles, which comes up with Taylor in her part as well. You also get, as someone who, when I do my screenshots, I always screenshot whenever there's food, because KyoAni is really good at doing food. Yes. You get the saddest food in any KyoAni thing ever, because the little, like, soup with quotation marks around it. I mean, if you say, like, you put some, like, food stuff in water, if that makes it, that's heated, if that makes it soup, it's technically a soup. But it's just, like, a broken little chipped, like, kind of bowl with just like a couple of seeds and like a root and like maybe like the corner of a piece of bread and like a green pea, and that's it. And it's just so sad because it barely constitutes food. But Taylor is so happy to have it because she's happy to have anything. She's happy to be with her big sister. But it is as someone who has taken a lot of screenshots of a top-down shot of a table with a bowl of food on it, because KyoAni's food just always looks fucking great. It's like, oh my God, they're very good at doing food, but here it has a very different effect. Instead of making me hungry, it just makes me very sad.
Yes. So this is also where I want to get into talking about Benny a little bit more, because he's a character who was fairly minor in the TV show, gets a really big showcase here, especially in this kind of part 1 to part 2 transition. But speaking of that transition, the moment where it happens, where part 1 ends and we get the title on screen in the same fashion as the TV show, the "If You Get Lonely, Call My Name," obviously written in Japanese, and it's white on black, but then that turns into this like blue effervescent thing going over the titles, and then it cuts to this harsh shot underwater pointing up at the sun, and then this anchor just drops into the frame right at the camera and bubbles go everywhere. It's an awesome shot, and what it's doing is it's pulling us right back into the prologue of the movie where we saw Taylor getting off the boat and reorienting us that we are a couple years later, and that is the specific relationship between all of these scenes. But that is, and it's also on a technical level, I'm not quite sure how they did it. The anchor must be CGI, but the way like it comes through and it juts through the water, I have to imagine if Kigami Yoshiji did not literally draw that, someone asked for his advice, because it is like such perfect, great water animation, particularly the physicality of something big, metallic, and heavy dropping through the water into our line of sight. I love that shot.
Yeah, it's so cool. Yeah, it is a great transition because you're just hanging on that title card for a while, and then slowly the color fills into it, and you're not entirely sure what's going on. And I think especially like it, because it's like blue and there's a little bit of white in there, you kind of think it's going to be the sky, and then when it comes in, it's like it is the sky, but it's all distorted because you're looking at it from underwater. It's a really cool shot. But then you get the big reveal. The one we are all waiting for this movie, which is, if we're going 3 years in the future, how has Benny become even more of a twink than before? And you thought he couldn't send a more clear message to the world, but he definitely has, because not only does he have the big black knee-high boots with a massive heel, now he's got big black knee-high boots with a massive heel that I think is a bigger heel, and it's a more narrow heel, and he's got frills on the back of the boot. Which it's just like, okay, I see where you're at, bro. And then the camera pans up a little bit, and you also see that now his shirt has like an open back that's laced up, and it's like, okay, dude, it's an afternoon on a work day. Calm the fuck down. Like, save it for the clubs, man. Like, holy shit. It's like, you might as well, it's Benny's character design is wild, and I fucking love it. Like, I can't believe they went so hard on this, because no other character in the show dresses like this other than the women. And it's like,
do the women have heels like that tall? I mean, my God.
Actually, they're probably a little bit taller. I mean, they make a point of showing Iris's heels, right? Because she, can barely walk on them, and she falls down the stairs in episode 4. Catalea obviously does, because she's like gorgeous and beautiful and everything. And Violet's boots have a bit of a heel on them, but like Benny is in competition or winning for biggest heels. And he definitely is winning most fuckable heels. Like, it's just his here, man. It's like he's doing it.
I'm looking at a shot of Violet's feet here. That sounds weird to say out of context, but I'm looking at a shot of Violet's feet, and she does have a heel. It's much shorter, and it is wider at the back, so that it's more even for her to walk on. Like, you wouldn't feel the like narrowness of it. I've never walked in a heel, but just looking at it, that's my assumption. But yeah, Benny's, they want you to know he's a master at walking in those things. Those boots were made for walking, and Benny walks in them. And it's just, I love that it is so much, you learn so much about his character, and that is all purely character design. Not a word of that is in the script, right? Like, that is all just the character designer going rogue and making great choices about Benny. But I think it makes sense. It fits with his character. It gives him this, like, I think, richer life that you can kind of imagine. I love it. And of course, he enters the movie at the end of part 1, delivering the 2 letters to Taylor. And I think it's an interesting scene because he does not understand the impact of what he's doing in that scene, because it's just another job that Violet, who, to be frank, it's probably a little annoying to be Violet's coworker sometimes because she gets into a lot of stuff that you have to deal with, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the doll that airdropped into an active war zone to write 1 letter for 1 dude. It's probably a big demand on her coworkers sometimes.
Yeah, Benny's good at his job. He cares about it. I don't think it's his whole life, as evidenced by the boots and all of that, right? He has other things on his mind. But, there's that scene. He is nice to her. He reads it. He's not as nice as the nun in the flashback in part 2. But then I do like, of course, when Taylor comes back, and it is this thing that, for Benny, was just another day, that now becomes this thing that in part 2 kind of overtakes his life for a little bit here. And of course, in the end, he does ultimately rise on his heels to the occasion and find Isabella, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and it is fun to give him just a little bit more of a spotlight, because he's in the TV show and he's a fun character, but he's like, if there is a comic relief character, it would be Benny, right? Like he's is mostly there for a couple of little gags. He writes his like terrible poem, which is hilarious, right? That's like kind of his role. And here they use him to kind of center the full post office experience, because he is the guy who's responsible for delivering the letters. And I don't think we talked about the voice actor last time, because we didn't talk about the character that much. And it's Uchiyama Koki, who's a great voice actor. We talked about him a lot on Weekly Suit Gundam, because he's Banaji in Unicorn Gundam. That's like one of his early kind of starring roles, and he's in a whole bunch of stuff. He's also Meruem in Hunter x Hunter, the bad guy in the Chimera Ant arc, which if you've seen Hunter x Hunter, you know how good that performance is. But he's just like a great actor, and it's fun to have that character get more of a spotlight here, because it also just keeps things fresh, and it is a nice way to kind of give part 2 a different flavor, because it opens up with this whole thing of him going and delivering this letter to this old lady who asks him about this radio tower thing they're building that she can see in her window, and he's sort of just very annoyed that this old lady seems, this is probably like the 100th time she has asked him about this tower, and he's like, I don't know, I'm a postman, like it's a radio, it broadcasts things, I have no idea, like I don't know when it's going to be finished. And then at the end, the movie kind of bookends with him going to that lady and delivering the letter again. But now he is amused and he has a little smile on his face, because Taylor has kind of helped show him again, like the beauty of what he does. And yeah, the day in, day out is, a lot of like hard labor and a lot of like, very kind of monotonous, the same thing over and over and over again. But his relationship with Taylor helps show him like what he's doing is very special. He is like what she tells him, like, a postman's job is to deliver happiness. And that, all the little things like him knowing and memorizing every single address in the whole city. And Taylor's looking at us like, oh my God, that's amazing. And he's just like, well, this is just what a postman does. And it's like, no, your job is amazing. It is really hard. You are really good at it. You're so good at it, you don't realize how hard it is. And I'm very happy that he does exploit the whole situation with the Taylor thing to get his boss to buy him a fancy new yellow bike with a giant sidecar, and how satisfied he is with that purchase. It's just a nice little thing that gives this second part a very different style and kind of narrative quality to it, as you've got Benny here. He's kind of our rock for part 2.
Benny, the thing I love about this character, and I'm glad this movie gave us a chance to talk about him a little more, is that he is the protagonist of a different version of this show. There is a version of Violet Evergarden that is more of a comedy, that is about Benny over here doing his day in, day out stuff with his shitty bike, and this movie, honestly, this movie is a bigger deal for him in some ways than it is for Violet, because he gets his new bike. Violet gets a new little sister, I guess, but, Benny gets a bike out of this thing. It's pretty great for Benny. Then he goes on a whole journey and all this stuff. And I do love that. And I think that is where, like, Uchiyama is so crucial to this, because he is, such a fascinating actor to me because I can always recognize his voice, but then remembering all the people that voice belongs to is impossible because it's such a diverse range of roles. Like, if you were to tell me that Banaji in Unicorn Gundam and Rui from Kimetsu no Yaiba are the same voice actor, I'd be like, get the fuck out of here. That's crazy. And you can hear it if you put them next to each other, but they're really different. You know, he's Inumaki in Jujutsu Kaisen, which I know that character doesn't talk much, but when he does, you can tell who it is. But he just... Yeah, so many different characters, and you need someone who could, I think for Benny, for that quality I was talking about, he's doing a side character actor kind of thing here, but you can also imagine the version of it where Benedict is the hero in his own story, because I think in his mind he is. He is very much...
Yes, in his mind he 100% is. And yeah, that is one of the things that's fun about the characters. He does, like, it feels like there should be a Benedict spinoff, you know, and he's like it's like that character in Sound Euphonium played by Tadakota Azasa that weirdly pops up more often than you'd think, who's the marching band girl at the other school, because there's a whole series of novels about her, so they kind of would, like, you know, just when there's an opportunity, they kind of throw her in there. And Benny kind of felt like that in the TV show, where there's the whole Postman TV show off on the side, and he's trying to track down clients and figure out where this letter needs to go and all that kind of stuff. He's got his whole other life. You know, he's trying to hit on women and get them to eat fried yakisoba with him. It's a whole thing. He's got a whole life going on. He's got his fucking boots. It's a lot.
Benny, the poster, the tagline, you know, delivering letters by day, clubbing by night, the Benedict's Blues story.
And you know, I'm sure he's got like a very, you know, rich, complicated life with like Roland as well. There feels like there's a whole history there probably as well.
Roland gets a cameo here.
Yes.
I love the Roland cameo where we learn that he has retired, which makes sense given his age, but also he still just hangs around the post office all the time because what else is he going to do? He loves this. He really loved this job, you could tell. He is not like Benny. He has no cynicism about it. So what the hell else is he going to do? He's going to come by and hang out with his post office buddies. Roland, we stand a king here at the Japanimation station.
I mean, it's like they needed to put at least a little scene with him, because as soon as you cut to 3 years later and we're in Leiden, it's like the only thing you're asking is like, well, what's Roland doing? Where's Roland at? Like every scene, I'm just like, well, is Roland going to show up? What's his life like? Because it is one of the things that's very fun about part 2 of this movie is because it pushes the timeline forward, it is fun to like revisit these characters, even though they're not the biggest characters in the world in the first show, because the first show is so much about Violet's journeys and like each episode, where does she go and what does she do? But we have kept on coming back to this post office and the other dolls and Benny and Roland and Claudia, obviously. And we've kind of learned this place in this world, and it was particularly prominent in the first 3 or 4 episodes of Violet Evergarden, that it's fun to kind of come back here and be like, this is our home. This is our center. We travel most of the time in the series, but they're kind of always been here in the background. And it's just cool to see the way in which everybody other than Violet has a little bit of an updated character design. Benny's got a haircut, so he finally decided to get rid of the, like, front rat tail. I don't even know what the fuck you call that thing, like that huge piece of hair up front that's like he's like rocking some weird Padawan look. Claudia looks like notably older, which I like. Like he looks even more like a dad, which I enjoy. Everyone's just kind of got a slightly different outfit. And so you just get to see everyone's got an updated character design. The world's a bit different. The city looks different. There's like a second city across the bridge now. You've got cars on the street, which is like very prominent in the first couple scenes as Taylor is trying to cross the street and stuff like that. You've got a telephone that Benny is on at one point. They're building the radio tower. So you just get this sense that after the war, like things have gotten better for people, that like, you know, the technology has advanced, the city's getting more developed. They turn on the electrical lights at night, so they're not burning gas anymore. And it's cool to just sort of like get these little glimpses at this different world that Taylor is going to get to grow up in and get to see it through her eyes. And I think it makes it feel so fresh and kind of you're rediscovering the setting of Violet Evergarden all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite little things about this movie. It's one of the things that makes it feel, just give it that little extra cinematic oomph to it, where like, it's not like anything earth-shattering has happened necessarily in their lives, but the world is moving on. They are growing older. People, everyone's attitude has just settled a little bit into the world. Even Violet, I think you can tell, is more in her rhythm. So like when she is helping Taylor do the post office job and she dresses up in the uniform, the postal uniform, and everyone's kind of reacting to that because Violet Evergarden has a look that everybody is very aware of, and now she's dressed up like a postman and everyone can see how that's kind of weird, and she's rediscovering this a little bit. All of those things are very nice, and I like any kind of, because the ending of the show is such a life goes on kind of ending, I like that when we follow it up, it's a very life goes on continuation, and we're a couple years later, and of course the passage of time we talked about a lot on the TV show episode is very crucial to the show, and I think the movie building that in with this two-part structure is very good. Of course, there is a bunch of beautiful time lapses in the middle of this movie to help us get there that, oh my god, if you thought the time lapses in the show looked good, wait until you see it with a movie budget.
Yeah, they're definitely more elaborate. Like it is, the time lapses look incredible. And with the time passing thing, there's one of my favorite little moments in this movie that really kind of like points that out, is you have the scene where they're going into Claudia's office to ask his permission to have her, Taylor, help deliver letters and stuff. And they start begging him, and there's this great shot of where Taylor puts her hand up into prayer, and then Violet looks at her, and then she does the same thing, which is adorable. But you're seeing the shot from Claudia's point of view as he's sitting behind the desk, and then it fades to the moment at the end of episode 1 where you've got Violet from, like primordial Violet, basically, with the green skirt and all that, the costume she had in the very first episode before she had her whole like outfit picked out. And it's her telling him, like, I want to know what I love you means. It's that moment. And you just get this moment of, like, Claudia reflecting on that, that time when she told him that, and he was sitting right there at that desk, and she was across the way and asking him that with this, like, pained, confused expression on her face. And then now it's her with this little girl saying, hey, this is the little sister of one of my best friends. Like, please, can we help her? And it's like how much Violet has grown as a person is so potent there, and seeing it through the eyes of Claudia, who, again, he more and more over the course of the series and this movie just feels like he's Violet's dad. You have that, we didn't talk about it in the TV show episode, but you have that little moment at the end of the TV show where he writes a letter to his future daughter that Cat Leia reads out to everybody. And it's like this secretly, obviously, I think, you read it as like, yeah, it's like maybe he will have an actual, like, his own kid one day, but also he's really talking about Violet. And Violet is his kid. He thinks of her like she's his kid. And him looking on at her in this moment, and that, like, you don't get a huge visual, like, emotional reaction from him, but you can feel inside this dude is such a proud dad at this moment.
Oh, it's wonderful. And Claudia only has a couple of scenes in this movie, but I think they are all on that theme. They are all on that sense of, like, he's kind of done it. He's, like, gotten his kid in a good position, and like all of his, like, metaphorical kids at the post office where he is also kind of the dad, right? And, like, they're moving on. There's the scene that, like, I like the scene where he buys the dress for her is also a little bit, he's walking around town, and he's just a little like a dad whose, like, kid has left and gone to college. It's just a little like, I don't have anything to do. They don't need me anymore. Violet's fine, and it's a good thing, but it's also a little confusing for him. And this is something KyoAni is good at, is sometimes you have characters who are off on the fringe, but they have a rich inner life that is suggested to us in very brief glimpses, and I like that. And Claudia, definitely they do that in his just, small handful of scenes here.
Yeah, he's just such a good character, and whenever he shows up, it puts a big smile on my face. Yeah, so some other big moments in part 2. Tom mentioned it earlier, but I just want to point out again, I just think it's so cool that they've switched the lights to be electrical lights in the way that the city just physically looks different. Yep. It really points out how good they are, that it's not that the buildings are that different or whatever, it's just the way that it's lit is now different at night. And you just get the little things of, like, the car lights, headlights coming by and lighting them up, which is something that KyoAni are pros at, because they've always, every KyoAni show other than Violet Evergarden has at least one scene of two characters walking by the road at night and them being illuminated as cars drive past. You get a little bit of it here. All that stuff is really, really cool. And it's also like the Violet's room feels different for similar reasons, right? Like, it's just the whole vibe of the city in this space feels different because the light is different.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of good stuff with that. I like all the scenes with her and Taylor in their rooms together. You know, obviously we talked about the hairbrushing scene. We talked about I don't know if we mentioned the scene where she comes to sleep at night. There's a little detail I love there, which is that when Taylor comes to sleep in Violet's bed, we see that Violet lays out the brooch that the Major gave her at night next to her pillow, which is so sweet. Like, I love, like, it is a totem for her. It is very important. Like, she is in a healthy place and everything, but I like that this, you know, she holds it tight. It doesn't feel like it's a thing that is stopping her from moving on. It's just so sweet, you know?
Yeah, I noticed that detail as well and really loved it. It is just like, it's so good to see those little moments of just like the extra life. And of course you have a moment later on, I think in the bath where Taylor is talking about how like she never got to own anything, and so she's happy to be able to get new clothes, but then she takes out her little fucked up teddy bear that is the little teddy bear that you see in one of the flashbacks that Amy sewed for her. It's one of the only things she has from Amy, and she's like, you know, this is my like one thing, this is like my treasure in this world. And then Violet like touches her chest because the brooch is on the other side because they were bathing. And she just says it's wonderful to have something that's like a treasure of your own. And it's such a great little moment in the connection between these two people.
Another moment I was scouring your screenshot gallery for, and it was hard to find because it's a very dark image with a very small center point. But I love when they get into Violet's room, and Taylor is fascinated by, Violet has a stuffed animal too. She has the little dog, obviously. And Violet has the dog on the desk looking out over the town. And then when they leave and shut off the lights, it cuts to outside. And it's this little great frame within a frame shot of the dog faced to look out the window. And it's just this very like big cavernous image. And the one little center point is this stuffed animal dog pointing out to look outside. That's awesome. That's a great shot.
Yeah, it's so good because they draw attention to it because when Taylor comes in, she says to the little stuffed animal, like, oh, you looking out the window? Yeah, it is great. It's so nice to see how much Violet really treasures this one little gift that Claudia gave her in episode 1. Also, you do get the detail that Claudia still has the bunny and the cat stuffed animal from episode 1. The two that she didn't pick are still on his desk. And I love that they've been there for like 4 or 5 years at this point. It's really good.
Like he's Professor Oak, but no one took the other 2 Pokemon.
Exactly, yeah. He's just got his Squirtle and his Bulbasaur here because everyone knows that Charmander's the best. And he's like, well, here, these are my buddies now. You do get to see Luculia here, Violet's first friend that she just seems to not realize is really her first friend. But, you know, it's like hopefully she realizes, you know, Luculia's here too.
Violet is very literal-minded. I guess if no one has said, I'm your friend, she just didn't... I did definitely, clock that moment too, Sean, that you were talking about, where I'm like, that's Violet, you have a lot of friends. I'm not sure this is fair. But, you know, to be fair to her, she is, as we said, very literal.
Yes, and you do get a fun little detail, just so you feel the passage of time that Luculia either is, I think she's like, has a fiance now, because she does have a ring on her finger, but the way they talk about it later is like they haven't actually been married yet, but there's some nice young man that she's with. You get the amazing elevator gag that you've talked about a couple of times, but just to point it out again, it is so funny. And I think the thing that makes it particularly funny is you have the whole process of them being like, what is this? It's some sort of elevator. Like, I think it takes you up some floors. They have to open the multiple doors with the gate because it's like an old school elevator. They get in and she like grabs the handle and she puts it the wrong way. And she's like, huh. And then she puts it the right way and they look up and go like, oh, wow. And you do get like this interesting, like, surprised expression on Violet's face that's not an expression you see very often, and she's like has like a little bit of wonder at it, and then you get that great shot of the exit where they need to get off of the elevator, and then she just sort of goes way past it. She goes like, whoa, 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 no, and then they go back down, but she goes a little bit too far down, and then it just cuts to them having gotten out of the elevator, and Violet going kind of under her breath is like, it probably would have been faster just to take the stairs, huh? And I love feeling that like Violet is kind of like this old fogey at heart, you know, that this newfangled technology of the elevators is like, I'll just walk, you know, it's fine. I don't need any of this elevator shit.
There is probably a reason why old elevators like that had attendants who would do it for you, because it's not just pressing a button like we have now. It is a weird, difficult machine.
Yes, and I love the idea of like if you just like go back and forth a bunch to figure out how to get off the elevator is pretty great.
It's absolutely great. And then obviously, there's the whole climax of the movie. I like that it is Benny who takes Taylor to go see Amy/Isabella. I like their whole journey. I mean, obviously also Taylor gets to, give his new motorcycle a workout, which is awesome. But obviously all the landscape stuff, which is very like, oh man, this is like, giving Studio Ghibli a run for their money with all these like amazing, like, countryside landscape shots. Totally beautiful. I like that they have the little campfire scene. And then the place where Amy lives and this whole like little garden world she has for herself, but that's kind of her boundary and her environs. It's incredible. And you talked also earlier, Sean, about that we have a big contrast in her costuming here. And I wondered if you wanted to follow up on that.
Yeah, well, that's just like this whole scene at the end is amazing. This is the part of the movie I like remembered so vividly. Because it's so dreamlike, where you kind of come up upon this big walled kind of manor, and then they get into the garden. There's a nice detail that a lot of the flowers in the gardens, there are a lot of violets, and then there are some of those white drossel flowers. I'm sure that there's probably meaning to the other flowers as well, but I'm not a flower expert. But I know what a violet looks like. And it says like, okay, there's some violets, there's the white flowers. They sneak in, you get this little moment of where they're kind of in the hedges, and you get this sense of like so many of these shots that are framed around the edges with flowers, which is a great aesthetic because it strikes of the classic shoujo manga cutaways to girls, looking at like, oh, this like, though the prince, oh, he's so handsome, he's so beautiful, and the roses then come around the edges. I've been watching a lot of Sailor Moon over the past month, so you get a lot of those kinds of shots, and it's just kind of a classic manga kind of expression. And here you get that kind of literalized in a bunch of shots where they're actually literally surrounded by the flowers, and it creates this very sort of dreamy, otherworldly atmosphere. And yeah, then you get Amy comes out, but she is in this almost like kind of mirror Evergarden, like Violet Evergarden outfit. So her hair is done up like Violet's. She is wearing this big dress, but the dress is all black with like a gold trim. And with it's not black, it's like a really dark blue, but then she has a black kind of like, probably undershirt's probably not the right word for it, but some sort of garment underneath this dress in this kind of tunic look. That is, you see these black sleeves coming out. And then she also has an umbrella. So that is a black umbrella with white trim. And it just creates this very like, if you were playing Super Smash Brothers and you picked the 2P colors for Violet Evergarden, this is the character you'd play as, because she also has the like dark kind of brown, almost like brownish red hair. And yeah. It's so interesting to see that, of where she is this person who's like so locked off. This is another like extremely Victorian trope. This is like the most Victorian aspect of the episode of Violet Evergarden ever, or the movie, with the first half in this, of this woman, it's like Mr. Rochester's wife in the attic kind of thing, like this woman of the manor that nobody ever really sees. This is the plot of like a third of the fucking Sherlock Holmes episodes, I swear to God. And she, you only ever see her in the garden like once every Thursday or something. And if this was an actual Victorian thing, she'd be the wife of some like Indian colonial soldier or something that never came home, and all that kind of stuff. And it's so like just striking visually to see this character that has ended up in this situation where she has been in this cage the whole time, and she sort of modeled herself visually a little bit off of Violet, but this very dark, earthy kind of broken down version of her. And then, of course, this whole scene then evolves over time. You get Benedict comes and gives her the letter, and you get her dropping the parasol, which then sort of, covers her in light. And then you have these just incredible shots of Taylor off in the corner in the garden, covered by trees, surrounded by the flowers, and she's in shadow, but you just get these speckles of light coming through the branches of the tree on her. And these are like just some of the most beautiful images in the whole movie, and how well they have drawn Taylor in this expression that's just impossible to find, right? Of this kind of like wonder and almost like this kind of mystical sense of looking at this woman who she's almost forgotten, but is kind of everything to her, and looking on at this. And then when she reads the letter, she gets to the part where she says, my name is Taylor Bartlett. I am Amy Bartlett's little sister. That's when she starts crying, and then the Taylor starts crying as well. But that's also at the moment where you get maybe the most striking shot in the whole movie, which is a shot of just a whole frame that's just blue. And then you get in slow motion 2 birds that come up from the bottom of the frame that you're looking up at their bottoms with their wings spread out, and they jet up into the frame in slow motion. And then you see that it's Taylor and Amy in the past in the winter staring up at it. You get a POV shot from Taylor looking up at Amy, who reaches her hand up into the sky like she did in the middle point of part 1. And then you just get a montage of all these little moments of them together, them making the 2 snowmen that you saw outside of their little house, her falling asleep, and Amy looking over her. And there were 2 moments where both Taylor woke up and saw Violet and saw Amy and Violet, and then you also saw one where Amy in part 1 woke up and saw Taylor and Violet, and this kind of mirrors those shots. And then you get this incredible sequence of them in kind of the bed together as orphans in the past, only it's sort of this weird kind of distorted version of the image, and you realize it's distorted because the camera pulls out and you're seeing that in the pupil of Taylor, and it pulls out further and further until you see her surrounded by those flowers and the light coming in from up top. And it is just this beautiful, otherworldly, strange moment of Taylor reacquiring all these memories she had lost and repressed from her childhood, and this connection being made again. And the way that it's shown through the light and the flowers, the memory of the birds, the memory of the time together in the snow, it is just, and then all of that obviously also accompanied with fucking Evan Call's music, which is just amazing. Yes. It just is, this is that gut punch moment of the movie. This is the one where you're like, oh, fuck, right, I'm watching Violet Evergarden, and there is no such thing as an episode of Violet Evergarden that does not make you tear up.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good breakdown of the ending. I particularly am moved by, I think, the way they do the POV of Taylor in the bushes, in the, gardens, trying to buy all these flowers, and the child's eye perspective on what is going on. There is something very Ghibli-esque about that feels like a little bit like My Neighbor Totoro or The Borrower Arrietty, of the kind of seeing the world from this like smaller, younger perspective. But obviously, with the KyoAni spin on it, that gorgeous lighting, which is a mix of, hand-drawn stuff and some digital illumination elements, but it is absolutely perfect. And yeah, that striking insert of the flashback at the heightened moment of emotion is such a perfect way to represent this. The 2 birds, the birds, but not just the birds, but the outstretched hand as well as this symbol, which of course the kind of final moment of this whole climax is on the drive home when Taylor reaches her hand up at the sunset and does the same thing. And then we kind of get the epilogue of the movie after that, including the kids who were making fun of Benny's bike earlier now and admiring his new yellow bike and its sidecar.
Yes.
But anyway, that sequence is a absolutely dynamite conclusion. And again, even though the stakes are by no means bigger than anything that happened in the TV show, there are episodes of the TV show with much higher stakes than this, it feels appropriately cinematic because we have spent 90 minutes building to this point. We've gone, literally across time in this movie. And, it feels like it earns that title of what is the Auto Memory Doll's relationship to eternity. I think we're seeing that here.
Yes. And it's like all the, what we were talking about earlier about using the wide angle camera stuff. Like here is where I think it pays off dividends, because so much of it has felt like, this distance that separates people, but there's something about just having this huge wide frame that is just this solid blue that then is interrupted by these 2 birds. It's such a beautiful image. And then that comes in at the other most powerful image to me in the movie, which is when you get to this kind of epilogue sequence. You do get a little moment of Violet looking up and seeing 2 birds go over, but then you get this incredible big sweeping shot where you're from inside Amy's new mansion that she's at, where you've seen this in one other brief little moment where they're kind of thinking about Amy, and you see a brief moment of her in her whole like kind of evil costume, whatever, probably the better word to use there, but it gets the point across. And you see she has her teddy bear and with the little red necklace that she got in part 1 is there. Now you're here again, but that whole space is flooded with light with this giant bouquet of all these flowers. And then this window is open and you have the curtains blowing in the breeze. The camera pushes through the open window, through the curtains, and you see that outside lake area with the garden that we were in earlier with Taylor, and now we have Amy is running through it and she's in this big white dress like she was in the dance scene, and she comes out, takes the kind of the back of her braid out, and then her big kind of done up Violet Evergarden style hair comes free and is big and open, kind of like what Taylor's hair has looked like. She's got her letter, and then probably like the best shot in terms of using the widescreen is here, where she then just shouts out the word Taylor at the top of her lungs. Just an amazing line read there by Kotobuki Minako. It's so powerful. But you have this huge shot that is just her in the left third in her dress, leaning forward out into towards the right of the frame, and the whole right of the frame is this huge image of the sky with these big sweeping thin clouds across it. And it's like how much for specifically Amy, her side of the movie is so intense and it's so kind of claustrophobic and she's so closed in. She's in this jail even when she's before been trying to reach up to the sky. In the terms of the current timeline, she's reaching up towards a canopy that's covered over her for this moment of like, she just gets to be in the sky, basically, this huge wide open frame with no obstructions, just big sweeping clouds guiding your eye through it. It's such a beautiful shot that's so liberating in terms of its feeling. And then you do get that shout seems to carry across the world, because then you see Taylor is in the Evergarden estate, where Mrs. Evergarden gets to also have a nice little happy ending that she gets an adopted daughter here. The white flowers of the Drossel Kingdom are there. They rustle seemingly in response to this cry. And then you, of course, have Taylor coming up, leaning on the window and smiling. And that's when you get your title for the second half of the movie. And it's just like, mic drop moment. It's such a amazing fucking ending to this film.
100%. That shot that you're talking about of her yelling before all of the clouds, at a glance, it's amazing because the clouds almost look like she is yelling them into existence. They could be, like if this were a manga, they would be like volume lines on the page to show you like how loud she is in the moment or something like that. It's very graphic and tactile, but I love that shot. I also think that sequence when she pulls the braid out of her hair and kind of rustles it and yells, that like minute of animation, there's a lot of competition. I think that's the best hair animation in the KyoAni filmography so far. It is tremendous and just a phenomenal piece of character animation. And yeah, then I think the quieter ending with a very contented Taylor kind of remembering this and hearing this, and again, making that connection that we started off this podcast talking about, which is that even if they never see each other again, all the kindness that Amy put out into the world with Taylor matters, it resonates, it survives, and Taylor is contented by it and is fulfilled by it, and these things do linger. That is to me, the eternity of the title that is, connecting these people across time and space. And it is absolutely lovely. And it is so key to what Violet Evergarden is, that it is the perfect, kind of Violet Evergarden story, especially on this kind of anthological level that the show often is.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, and just the way that the sky and the birds in the sky representing that like connection in what the title is at the end, which is just by calling your name, our bond is eternal. And the little choice of, I like that they don't have in that moment, they don't have Taylor say Amy. She says it earlier when she's in the bike with Benny. But here it's just Taylor and her seemingly hearing it. Obviously she can't literally hear it, but in the sort of the artistic stylings of the movie is like she has heard this echo through the world, and smiles at it. And then of course you get the ending theme being called Amy's, in some ways her response to that. It's just a perfect ending to this movie. And it's such a cool ending, because it's like, because the structure of the movie is so unusual and unorthodox that this ending is so powerful. It's like one of the things that makes the ending so good. Having these 2 chapters where you had this whole chapter just with Amy, then you've had this big chapter just with Taylor, and then you get this little moment of them sort of reuniting, but not even true, like not reuniting in a traditional way. You don't have the big, like, they come and embrace. And it's such a smart choice to not do that. This ending's so much stronger by not having them be physically together again. Like, they never share a frame again in the present timeline. They are always separated in that sense. And yet that's not important. That's not what the point is. And I think it would be very tempting as a storyteller to want to have and then they embrace again. But I think it just works so well to have this quieter, more kind of solemn, but more truthful feeling payoff.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a great movie. It's my favorite piece of Violet Evergarden so far. I know we've got, one more movie to go. I do have a question. Is the next movie also set like at this point in the timeline? Does it continue past this?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I also like there is one little addition to the ongoing continuity that is, Taylor is adopted by the Evergarden family. So she will be Taylor Evergarden, and that will be, I assume, the spin-off show in several years. Taylor Evergarden.
Yes, Taylor Evergarden, because we've had our fake World War I, and so unfortunately we know we now have to have a fake World War II, and that's it's like really nice. This is a really good ending for these characters so far, but wait until Taylor Evergarden fighting the Nazis or fake Nazis. That'll be a very epic new series.
I don't know if I want that. I will say, unless Violet Evergarden the movie ends in some extremely conclusive way where Violet can never do this again, I would take more of this any day of the week. I think Violet is such a malleable character, and the anthology structure is so good. Any time KyoAni wants to make another Gaiden, do an OVA, whatever they want, I would gladly take more of this, because I feel like this is one of the most elastic characters in their whole body of work.
Yeah, I mean, there is a whole novel worth of stories that they didn't adapt, and I don't know how those fit in, because they're sort of set sort of where the movie would be set, but they're different things because they were made. The movie is a totally original story. So yeah, I would be curious to know if any of that stuff could ever be adapted, or I know that there's 1,000 random short stories. Every time there's been a new Violet Evergarden thing, Akatsuki Kana has written some sort of short story, something. I watched a Japanese reaction video from when this movie came out, and they gave out little pamphlets, as they often do for these kind of special limited movie releases for these kinds of fan-driven things. And it was a little pamphlet that had 2 little short stories, but it was this woman who liked the show but didn't know much about it, and she's like, oh, they gave me a book. That's cool. Yeah. That's I love the idea of going to movie theater, somebody hey, if you went to see Lord of the Rings, and hey, you want the Silmarillion? Here you go, buddy. You just get it. That'd be great. But there's so many other stories. Yeah, I would love to see more other new Violet Evergarden. But of course, we do, for our sakes as a podcast, we do have a whopping 2.5 hours more of Violet Evergarden, because we got a big old movie still ahead of us.
Absolutely. So that is next week as we continue our journey through Rain or Shine and the life and times of Violet Evergarden. I'm excited to see where this all goes for what is now the ending.
Yes, I'm very, very excited to rewatch this movie. The movie that in many ways is one of the primary sort of seeds from which Japanimation Station was born. So next time, I know we just talked about the Violet Evergarden movie, but next time we're going to watch Violet Evergarden, the movie.
「それで自分に言い聞かせ進む」